They gave me a rusty sword and half a loaf of bread and called it inheritance. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it started, the morning of the skill ceremony in the great hall of House Arclight, with every retainer my father employed standing along the walls like furniture that could judge. I was 16. I had been the last to step onto the dais, which was not an accident. The order had been arranged so that my older brother Brett could go second to last and receive his result to applause, and I could go last and receive mine to whatever came after. My father Garrett stood at the front of the hall in his knight commander's coat, with his arms folded and his eyes on the crystal pedestal the way a man looks at a tool he expects to perform. He had not looked at me once that morning. He had not looked at me most mornings for 16 years, so the difference was academic. The crystal lit. The hall steward read the result aloud in a voice trained to carry. Land appraisal. 1 second of silence. I counted it. Then the laugh started, not from one person, but from the room, the way weather starts. A ripple that crossed every face I could see from the dais. The retainers, the cousins. Brett, who did not even try to hide it. My father, who did not laugh, but whose jaw tightened in a way I had learned years ago was worse. Land appraisal. A skill for reading soil, for checking whether dirt was worth planting in. In a family that had produced magic knights for 6 generations, the third son had received a skill that could not cut, could not burn, could not heal, could not hold a single combat stance. The room had already decided what it meant. They were not entirely wrong. They were just missing the part where the skill they were laughing at would eventually see everything they owned, everything they had built, and everything they were about to lose. But I did not know that yet either. Not standing on that dais, not with the laughter still crossing the hall like a slow wave looking for somewhere to land. My father stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The hall had been built to carry the voice of the family head the way a cathedral carries hymns, and he used the architecture the way he used everything else, efficiently, without affection. He announced the exile, formally, in front of every retainer, every cousin, every servant who had watched me grow up invisible in the corridors of this house. He called it a disownment, which was the legal term, but the destination made the meaning plain. The wailing wastes, the dead territory on the eastern edge of the kingdom where the land itself was supposed to be cursed, where nothing grew and the wind sounded like something dying. He was not sending me somewhere to start over. He was sending me somewhere to disappear. He did not meet my eyes. Not once during the announcement, not before it, not after. I had spent years trying to understand what that meant, whether it was contempt or discipline or something uglier that required him to look away from the thing he was doing. Standing on the dais that morning, I stopped trying. The answer did not matter anymore. What mattered was that from his position, from the logic of a house that measured worth in sword arms and bloodlines and battlefield rank, the decision was consistent. A son who could not fight was a son who could not serve the house. A skill that could not cut was a skill that shamed the crystal. The system he lived inside gave him exactly one answer, and he gave it. I did not agree with him, but I understood the arithmetic. That was the last thing I gave my father, the acknowledgement that he believed he was doing something rational. I would not give him anything else after that. Brett walked me to the back gate, not the front, the back, where deliveries came in and kitchen waste went out. He had volunteered for the escort, which meant the walk was not about logistics, it was about audience. The corridor was narrow, and the retainers who had followed us stood along the walls. Brett was taller than me, broader, and he carried the family-crest sword on his hip the way our father carried his. Not as a weapon, but as a fact about himself. When we reached the threshold, he reached across and unhooked the family-crest dagger from my belt. He held it up for a second, long enough that the retainers behind us could see. Then, he dropped a short sword in its place, rusty, chipped along the edge. The kind of blade you would give a scarecrow if you wanted the crows to laugh at it. He was not done. He glanced at my travel bag, the one with my rations for the walk, and used the toe of his boot to push the flap open and scatter half the bread onto the stone floor. He did it without bending, the way you kick something you do not want to touch, and he looked at the retainers while he did it. Not at me. The retainers were the audience. I was the show. I knelt, picked up the bread piece by piece. No rush, no looking up. Each piece folded back into the bag the way you fold laundry when you have nowhere to be and no one to impress. Because the truth was simple. I had 3 days of walking ahead of me through country I had never crossed. and leaving food on the floor would have been stupid, and I had stopped making decisions based on how they looked to the people in this house a long time before this morning. I stood. I bowed once, a single formal bow, the way my mother had taught me when I was very small, before she stopped being someone I was allowed to remember in this family's terms. Then I walked through the back gate. The gate closed behind me. I did not turn around. 3 days. That was the distance between the back gate of House Arclight and the western edge of the Wailing Wastes. I walked them alone. The countryside changed slowly around me. Farmland first, then sparser forest, then rocky scrub, where the soil turned gray and the trees grew shorter, as though the land was gradually losing interest in being alive. The travel rations lasted if I was careful. The rusty sword would not draw clean from its scabbard, which I discovered on the first evening when something moved in the brush and I reached for it. I did not need it that night, but I learned something about the weapon my brother had given me. It was not a gift with hidden value. It was exactly what it looked like. A blade designed to make the last days interesting, in the worst sense of the word. On the second night, alone by a fire I had built from dead wood and stubbornness, I thought about Martha. She had been a rabbit beast woman. Long ears, soft voice, hands that were always in the soil. My father had employed her as the estate gardener when I was small, and she had been the only person in that house who ever crouched down to my height and spoke to me like I was a person instead of a problem. From her, I learned how to crumble soil between my fingers to feel what would grow there, how to read the color of dirt the way some people read faces. Once, long before I had my skill, as though she already knew, she told me it was the power to hear the voice of the land. A gentle power, she said, perfect for a gentle boy. My father fired her the season I turned 9. She had been too close to me. That was the stated reason, which was also the real one. Closeness to me was a resource the house did not want spent, because spending it implied the resource had value. I did not know where she was now. I carried a small soil charm she had made me, tucked inside my coat, where no one in the family had ever thought to look. Sitting by that fire on the second night, with 300 miles of nothing ahead of me, I pressed my thumb against the charm and remembered the way she crumbled earth between her fingers. She was the reason I could still do the next thing. She had always been the reason. The house that fired her did not know it, but everything I was about to become started with a woman they had thrown away before they threw me away. End of the third day. I crested a ridge and stopped. Below me, stretching to the horizon in every direction I could see, was the Wailing Wastes. Dead gray topsoil, no trees, no grass, no color except the faint yellow-green of miasma curling between rocks like fog that had forgotten how to lift. The wind came from somewhere low and far away, and it sounded like a long exhale, the kind an animal makes when it has been lying down for too long and no longer expects to stand up. That was where the name came from. The waste did not wail the way a person wails. They wailed the way the ground wails when nothing has lived on it for so long that the silence starts to vibrate. This was the territory my father had chosen for me, the worst land in the kingdom, the place the crown sent people it wanted the country to forget. Every farmer, every surveyor, every officer who had ever been posted here had written the same report. Cursed soil, no water, no value, no future. If I survived a year, it would be remarkable. If I survived 2, it would be a clerical error. I sat down on a boulder. I looked at the place where I was going to live, or not live, for whatever came next. I did not cry. I did not make a speech to the empty sky about what I would build or who I would prove wrong. I sat there with my bag and my rusty sword and the soil charm in my coat, and I felt, for the first time in 3 days, the full weight of what had happened settle into my shoulders, the way weather settles into stone, slowly, completely, without asking. I do not remember deciding to use the skill. I remember kneeling on the cracked dirt and placing my palm flat against the ground the way Martha had taught me, and I remember closing my eyes, and I remember the feeling that came after. Not a sound, not a light, but a knowing, as though the land beneath my hand had been waiting to be read the way a letter waits inside a drawer until someone finally opens it. The topsoil was thin, a few handspans of dead gray crust, the kind that breaks like old plaster when you push a stick through it. But beneath that crust, black earth, rich, dense, fertile soil compressed by centuries of ancient forest decomposition, layer after layer, deeper than anything I had seen in the estate gardens, deeper than anything Martha had ever described. The wastes were not cursed, the wastes were buried. Someone, or something, a long time ago, had covered the richest soil in the kingdom with a skin of dead rock and miasma, and every person who had ever stood where I was kneeling had looked at the surface and written their report and gone home. There was water, a massive underground river running east to west, tens of meters below the surface, carrying more volume than anything in my family's territory. Enough for a village, enough for a town, enough for 1,000 people and every crop they could plant. In the eastern rocks, I found iron, copper, exposed veins near the surface, raw and unworked, as though the earth had been trying to hand them to someone for centuries, and no one had ever bent down to pick them up. And deeper, in the southern fault line, faint but unmistakable. A magical signature so pure that I had to push the skill harder than I had ever pushed it to confirm what I was reading. Mithril, the rarest metal in the kingdom. The one my father's armorsmiths had begged the crown for permission to buy by the ounce. It was here, under the dirt my family had banished me to. I did not stand up. I stayed on my knees with my palm flat on the ground and my eyes closed, and I breathed once, the way you breathe when you have been holding something in your chest for a very long time, and the holding has finally become heavier than the letting go. The land my father called worthless was the most valuable territory in the kingdom, and no one, not his surveyors, not his officers, not his 6 generations of magic knights, had ever thought to look below the surface, because no one who looked at the surface had ever had a reason to. The skill the room laughed at was the only skill that could have found this, and the only person in the kingdom who had that skill was the son they had just thrown away. I stood up. I did not vow revenge. I did not name a kingdom. I did not narrate a plan to the empty sky about how I would make them pay. I looked at the rocks along the eastern ridge, and I found a flat slab that had cracked along a clean line. I broke it loose. I tore strips from the hem of my cloak and lashed the slab to the scabbard of the rusty sword. The sword my brother had given me as an insult, the scabbard that was too warped to draw from. It made a crude shovel, the kind of tool a person builds when the person has nothing and needs one thing. I walked to the spot where the underground river ran shallowest, a point near the center of the flat, where the skill told me the water was close enough to reach in days instead of weeks. I set the shovel against the cracked dirt. I did not even then believe I was building a kingdom. I believed I was digging a well. The kingdom was a thing other people would name later, after I had already stopped noticing the difference. I started digging. The morning after I found the water veins, I started digging. I had picked the spot the night before. Land appraisal showed me where 5 smaller veins met below a bed of soft clay, about 5 meters down. The overlay lit up in my mind like a map made of light and pressure, every layer labeled, every density graded. The convergence point was 15 paces east of where I had slept. I drove my shovel in and pulled up the first scoop of dry dirt. By the end of that first day, the hole was a meter deep and my palms were raw. I sat beside a small fire, chewing dried meat, watching 2 moons rise over the edge of the wastes, one pale, one faintly copper. The silence out here was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a place that had never been asked to make noise. I ate slowly, turned the meat strip over twice to make it last, and told myself 1 meter was enough for a first day. It was not, but I went to sleep anyway. Days 2 through 4 ran together. The shovel hit harder clay on the second morning, and my shoulders told me about it before my brain did. By the third day, my hands had blisters on top of blisters, and the muscles across my lower back felt like someone had tied them in knots and pulled. I kept digging. 2 meters, 3. The walls of the pit were taller than I was. I ate what I could find. The skill identified safe plants in the crevices between rocks, and I chewed them raw because building a fire at the bottom of a pit was not an option I wanted to test. At night, I climbed out, made a small cook fire, and lay flat on the dirt until the ache in my arms settled enough to let me sleep. I was not miserable. That was the part I did not expect. The loneliness was there, large and obvious, but underneath it was something I had never felt in the house where I grew up. Every meter of depth was mine. No one had handed it to me. No one could take it away by announcing it in front of a room full of retainers. The hole in the ground was the first honest thing I had ever owned. 4 meters by dusk on the 4th day. 1 more to go. On the 5th day, around midday, the shovel broke through. The clay gave way in a soft crumble, and water seeped in from below, slow at first, then faster. Within minutes, a thin layer covered the bottom of the pit. I dropped the shovel. I knelt. I cupped both hands into the water and brought it to my mouth. It was cold and clean, and it tasted like the ground itself had been keeping it safe for me. I drank again, and then I stopped because my hands were shaking and something hot was running down my face. And I realized I was crying, not the way a person cries when they are sad, the way a person cries when a thing they built with their own broken hands actually works. The first tears since exile. I let them fall. I did not wipe them away. I did not perform grief or relief or anything with a name. I just knelt there in a hole I had dug over 5 days and let the water and the tears do whatever they were going to do. Then I stood up. I wiped my face with my sleeve. I climbed out of the pit and sat on the edge, breathing. That was when I saw the blood. A dark stain on a flat rock, about 15 feet from the spring, fresh. Something large had bled here recently, and the stain was the wrong color for anything that should live in a wasteland. I walked over and crouched beside it. Land Appraisal answered before I finished asking. Wyvern neurotoxin, a poison strong enough to kill an adult wyvern within hours. Whatever had bled here had not bled from a scratch. Something enormous, something poisoned with one of the deadliest substances in this world was somewhere nearby, wounded, dying. I stood very still and listened. Wind, nothing else. But the blood trail led away from the rock toward a dark line of trees I had not explored yet. A forest at the edge of the basin, thick and low. The kind of place where the air itself looked like it did not want company. I should have stayed at the well. I should have barricaded and waited and hoped whatever was bleeding out there finished dying on its own. I picked up my water bottle, filled it at the spring, and followed the blood. The forest was darker than it should have been at midday. The canopy was thick, and something in the air thinned the light, a haze that sat between the trunks like old smoke. I followed the blood trail deeper, scanning the undergrowth with Land Appraisal as I went. That was when Martha came back to me, not as a memory I chose to recall, as a reflex. The skill showed me the chemical makeup of every plant I passed, and my hands knew which ones mattered before my brain caught up. She had taught me this years ago in a garden that belonged to a family that no longer claimed me, which leaves to crush for fever, which roots to boil for pain, which bright pale herbs, growing in clusters in rocky crevices, glowed faintly like moonlight because their chemistry was built to neutralize exactly the kind of poison that was killing whatever waited at the end of this trail. I found them in a crack between 2 boulders. I pulled them carefully, the way she had shown me, by the base of the stem so the roots stayed alive for the next growth. I ground them on a flat rock into a thick green paste, cupped it in my palm, and kept walking. The clearing opened without warning. One moment I was pushing through undergrowth. The next, I was standing at the edge of a gap in the trees and looking at something I had only ever seen in the illustrations of old books. A white tiger, enormous, the size of a draft horse, maybe larger. Its fur was pure white except where the blood had matted it dark along its flank, and from the center of its forehead rose a single horn, curved and pale as old bone. A sacred beast, the kind the founding myths said protected the land itself. It was dying. The great tiger lay broken on the forest floor, its breath coming in shallow, ragged pulls. The poison had done what poison does. I could see the damage without the skill telling me, but the skill told me anyway. Organ stress, nerve degradation, hours remaining if nothing changed. Its eyes, gold and enormous, locked onto me the instant I stepped into the clearing. It growled, low, long. The growl said what words would have said if this creature spoke aloud. Come closer, and I will use what is left of me to kill you. I set the rusty sword on the ground, the shovel beside it, nothing in my hands except a palm full of green paste and a water bottle hanging from my shoulder. The tiger's eyes tracked the weapons hitting the ground. The growl did not stop, but it changed. A question in it now, underneath the threat. I walked forward, slow, one step, then another. Every step was a decision, and every decision was the kind you cannot take back. The tiger lifted a paw. The claws were as long as my forearm. The strike came down in a blur of white and stopped inches from my face, close enough that I felt the wind of it push my hair back. I did not move. I extended the pace. The tiger held there, one paw raised, claws out, eyes locked on mine. Seconds passed that felt like seasons. Then the great head lowered, slowly, and the beast took the medicine from my hand with a gentleness that did not match anything else about it. My knees gave out. I came back the next morning with fresh water and more herbs. And the morning after that. And the one after that. 5 days. I kept my distance. I did not crowd the beast. I did not reach for the white fur or try to touch the horn. I brought water from the spring, ground fresh antidote paste, gathered mushrooms and edible roots, the skill identified as safe. I left everything within reach and sat a few paces away, quiet, while the tiger ate and drank and slept. Each morning the change was visible. The matted blood dried and flaked away. The shallow breathing deepened. The growl when I arrived softened from a threat to a habit, and then from a habit to something closer to a greeting. By the fourth morning, the beast was lifting its head when it heard my footsteps, and the gold eyes that had promised to kill me on the first day were watching me with something I did not have a word for. On the fifth morning, I arrived and the tiger was standing, fully upright, wound closed, white fur clean and luminous in the early sunlight that had finally broken through the canopy. It was the most beautiful living thing I had ever seen. I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it and felt a small, quiet ache in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. The beast was healed. It would leave now. That was how this worked. You helped a wild thing, and then the wild thing went back to being wild, and you went back to being alone. I turned to walk back to the spring. A voice that was not a voice stopped me. Not sound, pressure, meaning arriving inside my skull without passing through my ears. The beast was speaking to me, and what it said, paraphrased through whatever part of my brain was receiving it, was, wait. The tiger bowed its head, not submission, something older than submission. Respect offered from a position of strength to a position of kindness. It told me its name. It told me it was the guardian deity of this land, and that it had watched humans for longer than any human bloodline had existed. It told me it had been betrayed before, that the wound on its flank was not the first wound humans had given it, only the most recent. It told me that for 2 centuries, it had not found a single human whose soul it did not have to fear. I stood there, a 16-year-old exile with blisters on both hands and dried herb paste under his fingernails, and listened to a creature older than my family's history tell me I was the first. Then Frost spoke the only words in this phase that I will give you exactly as they arrived inside my mind. Your soul is the first I have not had to fear in 2 centuries. Let me be your sword and your shield. I did not know what to say. I told him I was not worthy of being anyone's master. The words came out quiet and honest, and I meant them. My entire upbringing had taught me I was not the kind of person anyone chose. Frost's answer was not words, it was action. Frost shrank, without warning, without ceremony. The enormous body compressed in a ripple of white light until what stood in the clearing was a kitten-sized white tiger with a small horn and golden eyes the size of acorns. He climbed up my leg, walked across my arm, and settled on my shoulder, and purred. I stood there in a clearing in a forest at the edge of a cursed wasteland with a sacred beast the size of a house cat on my shoulder, purring against my ear, and I did not know whether to laugh or cry, so I think I did a little of both. I decided to build a house. The spring needed protection. Frost needed shelter. I needed a place that was not a hole in the ground. I led Frost to a flat basin a short walk from the well, and before I could explain what I wanted him to do, he leapt from my shoulder, hit the ground as a cub, and stood back up as the full-size sacred beast, horn and all. One sweep of his paw carved a trench several meters deep and dozens of meters long through the rock and soil, and from the floor of that trench, hot water burst upward, 1 knee down. The skill answered, high concentration mana, healing properties, the kind of water that could mend fatigue, close minor wounds, accelerate recovery. The trench had broken into a buried aquifer that had been sitting under this wasteland since before anyone called it cursed. In the wall of the trench, where Frost's claw had sheared through rock, a strip of ore gleamed dull and heavy. The skill confirmed, iron, high purity, close to the surface and exposed in a clean seam. Frost looked at the steam rising from the hot spring and then looked at me. His tail swept once across the ground. "Thank you," I told him. The tail swept again, his version of a grin. Over the next week, we built the house. Frost in his full form felled trees from the forest edge. I stripped branches and notched logs with tools I had hammered out of the exposed iron using flat rocks as an anvil. The work was slow and rough, and nothing I built would have survived a carpenter's inspection. But by the 7th morning, there was a structure standing beside the spring that had 4 walls, a roof, a door that mostly closed, and a stone hearth inside, because Frost had made it very clear, in his wordless way, that he wanted a place to grill fish. I stood in front of it on that last morning. Frost sat on my shoulder in his cub form, his small horn pressing lightly against my jaw. Steam rose from the hot spring behind us. The well I had dug ran clear and quiet to the east. I called the cabin our castle. The joke was for myself. No one else was there to hear it, but the word felt right in a way I had not expected, because every room in the house where I grew up had belonged to someone else. And this one room, with its crooked door and its uneven floor and its too small window, was mine. Then I looked up and saw movement on a distant hill, a shape, small against the sky, getting closer, a carriage, approaching from the east, headed straight for the column of steam rising from the hot spring like a signal fire no one had meant to light. I watched it come. Frost's ears went flat against his head. His purring stopped. The world had found us. The carriage stopped at the edge of the clearing. A middle-aged man climbed down, sunburned and shrewd-eyed, and stood there staring at the steam column like he had stumbled into a dream he could sell. Frost's ears flattened on my shoulder. The merchant noticed him a half-second later. His mouth opened, closed. I watched the calculation happen in real time. Sacred beast, hot spring, iron ore, young lord in the middle of a cursed wasteland, and I could almost hear him pricing the story for every tavern between here and the capital. "Welcome to the Wailing Wastes," I said. "I am Adrian Arclight, lord of all this." I gestured at the cabin, the spring, and approximately 400 paces of dirt. He took the joke at face value. I was not entirely sure it was a joke. We traded a sack of iron ore for several silver coins. He loaded the ore with the kind of care a man reserves for things he intends to talk about loudly, and I watched the carriage shrink down the eastern road. The merchant would talk. Merchants always talk. And every ear that heard him, refugees, traders, soldiers, brothers, would eventually find this clearing. I had made the trade anyway. Winter was coming. I needed seeds, tools, things the cabin could not grow, and I had not dug a well with my bare hands to starve quietly. The silver coins clinked in my pocket like a clock starting. A month later, Frost's ears went flat again. I was splitting firewood when he stared east. I set the axe down and followed his gaze. 30 people on the path. Rabbit beastmen, long ears, lean frames, clothes mended past the point of dignity, children clinging to mothers, an old woman leaning on a younger man's arm, and at the front, a girl my age with short flaxen hair and large red eyes that swept the clearing the way a soldier sweeps a room, checking exits before checking faces. Maya. She stopped 10 paces from me. Her hand rested on a knife at her belt, not drawn, just there. "Are you the lord here?" I nodded. She told me plainly. Refugees from the Empire. Their kind were hunted, bought, sold. They had heard a rumor, a young human lord in the cursed wastes, guarded by a sacred beast who had turned dead soil green. They had walked for weeks. She knelt. 30 people watched her kneel. "Please," she said, "let us stay. We will do any work, even if we must become slaves. I cannot watch the children go hungry another night." Slaves. She was offering slavery because it was the only deal she had ever seen a human accept. I thought of Martha, the rabbit beast woman who taught me the names of every plant in my father's garden. The one kindness of my childhood, removed on purpose. "I cannot do that," I said. Maya's eyes widened. "I want an equal contract. Your people have senses I do not, hearing, smell, knowledge of the land. Your elder mentioned a farming tradition. I need all of it. In return, I will give you safety and a fair share of everything this land produces. Not as slaves, as partners." 30 pairs of ears turned toward me. The murmuring started low and grew. Not suspicion on their faces. Confusion. The shape of the offer did not fit any mold they had ever been pressed into. Frost dropped from my shoulder to the ground, and in the space between one breath and the next, the kitten was gone. The sacred beast stood at full height. He pressed his head against my side and held it there. The refugees recognized what it meant. The guardian deity of the land had chosen this human. Frost shrank back to cub form and climbed onto my shoulder. He yawned. Maya put the knife away. She took a breath, the kind that closes one life and opens another, and extended her right hand. The Beastman custom of equal contract. I shook it. Her hand was calloused and warm. "Welcome to my village, Maya." Behind her, an old woman stepped forward, trembling but steady-voiced. She spoke of an ancient tradition, the Moon Heritage farming method. If my skill and their knowledge were combined, the wasteland could become fertile. I looked at the cursed dirt beneath our feet. Beneath it, my skill had already shown me the black earth waiting. "Then, let us find out," I said. A month dissolved into labor. We made bricks from the clay soil, sun-dried, stacked, mortared with mud. Houses went up on the basin's south slope, one row at a time. Maya coordinated both crews with a voice that did not need volume to carry authority. I used my appraisal on every square pace of soil. Maya studied my readings against her tribe's stone tablet, a flat piece of slate carved with pictographs showing which crops to plant under which phase of the moon, root vegetables at the new moon, leafy greens at the waxing crescent. We divided the land into plots and matched each one to what it could grow. Frost dug the irrigation canal in one swipe of his full-size paw. He chased off small monsters and called rain clouds down on 3 separate afternoons. By the end of the month, the dead wasteland inside my basin was no longer dead. Tall grains stood in rows. Red turnips pushed through dark earth. Fruit trees showed their first green. The beastmen wept at the first harvest, not quietly. They stood in the field and cried the way people cry when the thing they stopped believing in happens anyway. A child pulled a turnip from the ground and held it up like a trophy and shouted that they would not starve anymore. Maya wept and laughed at the same time, and I understood that those two sounds can be the same sound if the relief runs deep enough. The harvest festival happened that night around a bonfire big enough to throw shadows across the entire basin. Food, singing, a circle dance the beastman taught me that I performed badly and nobody cared. Children chased Frost between the tables, and he let them catch him. For one night, no one was a refugee. No one was in exile. Late. The bonfire burned low. I sat at the edge of the clearing watching the last embers. Maya found me there. She sat beside me without asking. For a while, we said nothing. Then, quietly, she spoke. "My father was our leader before me. When the soldiers came, he told us to run. He stood at the entrance alone so we could get out. He did not follow us." The fire cracked. "I think he wanted to see a night like this." She stated it the way you state a thing that has lived inside your chest so long it has worn smooth, and the smoothness is the saddest part. I looked at her. The firelight caught her eyes, red and wet and steady, and something moved in my throat that I did not name. I swallowed once, hard, and looked back at the embers. There was nothing I could say that would not have been a performance, so I sat beside her and let the silence be the answer. The dwarves arrived on a Tuesday. I know because Hugo Hammerfall told me, unprompted, that Tuesdays were unlucky for travel, and the iron was worth the curse. Hugo was shorter than me, which was saying something, and twice as wide. He led a clan of 12 from the western mountains, and the first thing he did was look at the mud brick houses. "Brittle as a cold pour," he said. "Who built these? A child with a grudge against geometry?" I did not argue. I pulled a chunk of the ore and set it in his palm. He turned it over, held it to the light, bit it, which I later learned was a dwarf metallurgy test and not a dietary choice. "The forge," I said. "Priority access to the ore. Build whatever you want. In exchange, your clan settles here and shares its craft." He looked at the ore. He looked at me. "Grudging," he said, "is what this acceptance is." His clan was renovating the first house into stone before sunset. Liam Silverleaf arrived 3 days later, intending to rob us politely. I could tell because he introduced himself with the kind of smile that calculates your worth per syllable. Silver hair like moonlight, green eyes that had seen 2 centuries of deals go wrong. He surveyed the village, and his smile deepened in a way that meant he was already pricing everything. I did not give him the speech. I told him what he cared about. "I want you to handle our external sales," I said. "Fair prices to outside towns. In return, you keep a percentage of the profits. Predictable, scalable, yours." His smile vanished. For the first time since he had walked into the clearing, he was not performing. "You are either the most foolish nobleman I have met in 200 years, he said, "or the only only honest one. The cynicism fought the curiosity behind his eyes, and the curiosity won by a step. "Either way," he said, "I would like to find out which." He shook my hand. By the end of the week, Liam had trade routes sketched on a map I did not know we owned. The village exploded. Dwarves hammered stone into walls that would outlast their builders. Rabbit beastmen carried harvest to stalls that Liam stocked and sold before the vegetables could wilt. Hugo's forge coughed smoke from dawn to dusk, and the sound of his hammer became the village's heartbeat. Children of 3 species played in the same dirt. Frost watched from a rooftop, tail swaying. I stood at the edge of the small market that had appeared where the woodpile used to be, and I watched. I still did not believe I was building a kingdom. I believed I was solving the next problem, a grain surplus, a drainage issue, Hugo requesting a second forge because the first was too small for a proper sneeze. But standing there, watching a market where no one asked what species you were before trading with you, I felt that the well I had dug by hand 6 months earlier had become the center of something I could not yet name. 300 miles east, the wells of House Arclight ran dry. 3 village wells failed in a single month. Soil that had held for generations cracked and shifted. Crops yellowed at the roots and refused to fruit. Garrett Arclight stood at the window of his study, looking out at fields dying for a reason no steward, no mage, and no advisor could explain. The land was simply leaving, as if something that had held it together had been removed, and no one had noticed it was there until it was gone. No one connected the withering to the exile of a quiet third son 6 months earlier. The boy's skill had been for digging ditches. What could that have to do with the slow death of a territory? Nothing, they assumed. They were wrong. I did not know any of that. I stood at the edge of my village with Frost on my shoulder, watching the market close for the evening and the forge glow orange in the dusk, and I thought about the next well I needed to dig on the north side. The Wailing Wastes had a village now, 4 races, a forge, a market, a harvest that had made 30 refugees cry. I still carried the rusty sword my brother had given me. I had not traded it for a better one. I was not sure why. Maybe because it reminded me that everything I had built started with someone handing me the worst they had and telling me it was all I deserved. They were wrong about that too. Frost purred against my neck. I scratched behind his horn. Somewhere in the village, Hugo's hammer rang out one last time for the night, and the sound echoed off the basin walls like a promise that tomorrow there would be more. 300 miles east, the Arclight Manor was rotting from the inside out. I was not there. The story reached me later in pieces, through Liam's contacts, through trade road whispers, through the kind of rumor that travels faster than any horse because people enjoy telling it. What I am about to describe is what I know happened, assembled from fragments. Garrett stood at the head of the war table with both fists on the oak. A retainer had just told him the 3rd village well to fail. That month was the one near the southern granary, the one that had never once gone dry in the 60 years of Arclight stewardship. The land's magic circulation was collapsing. Soil was cracking. Trade caravans were rerouting because the mountain roads kept sliding. No one in the manor understood why. Brett was in the room. He had volunteered to investigate the crisis weeks earlier, ridden out with a squad of knights, tested the wells, surveyed the soil, and come back with nothing. His report had contained the word unknown 11 times. Garrett had read it without comment and set it on the corner of the table face down, and that silence was louder than any reprimand Brett had ever received. Then the second report landed. A retainer, visibly afraid, placed a single sheet on the table and stepped back. A rumor out of the northern trade routes. A village in the Wailing Wastes, the cursed land, had hot springs, mineral deposits, fertile farmland, and a population of multiple races living under a single contract. The village was reportedly led by the exiled 3rd son of House Arclight. Brett's face changed. I have been told it changed the way a lake changes when something large moves beneath the surface. Not the features, but the pressure behind them. What happened next happened alone in Brett's study, and I have reconstructed it from what he eventually told me years later and from what I already knew about the boy he had been. He read the report twice, The specifics forced themselves through his refusal. Hot springs, ore, farmland, a sacred beast. The skill the room had laughed at was apparently building things the family's own territory could not sustain. Then the memory came. Brett did not invite it. Memories like that one never wait for an invitation. He was 10. I was 3. We were on the eastern slope of the estate during his riding lesson. I had been told to wait by the fence. The ground shifted. I did not understand the word landslide at 3 years old, but I felt the soil move the way you feel a floorboard about to snap, and I ran toward Brett, who was standing under the overhang where the rock face was already cracking. I grabbed his sleeve and pulled. The boulder that came down missed his right shoulder by the width of a hand. He looked at me. I looked at him, and then he shoved me away and said a single word: creepy. I remember his eyes when he said it. I was 3, and I remember his eyes. That is the kind of detail a child keeps without knowing why. Brett, alone in his study 20 years later, knew exactly why he had said it. He had always known Adrian's skill was not useless. That was the problem. The quiet little brother who never asked for anything, who never fought back, who sensed landslides at 3 and read soil at 16. That brother had always been doing something Brett could not name and could not match. And the hatred Brett carried was not superiority. It was the sound a man makes when he has been losing a war he cannot see. He went to Garrett. He pitched it as pacification, confiscate the village's wealth, put the demi-humans to work as labor, restore the family's standing. Garrett, whose territory was dying and whose pride was dying faster, granted him 300 soldiers without asking a single question about his youngest son's safety. The army marched under the Arclight crest. I was 3 days east, finishing the last of the Harvest Festival cleanup, and I did not know they were coming. The afternoon Liam came running was the afternoon everything changed. I was stacking the last of the dried grain bundles near the storehouse when I heard hooves. Fast, ragged, nothing like Liam's usual measured trot. Frost lifted his head from my shoulder. Liam rounded the hill path at a dead gallop, slid off his horse before it stopped, and crossed the distance to me in 6 long strides. His face told me everything before his mouth caught up. Brett Arclight, 300 soldiers, 3 days out, marching to crush what he was calling a rebellion and plunder everything we had built. The fear spread through the village, the way fire spreads through dry grass, not in words, but in posture. Rabbit beast women pulled their children indoors. Men who had been laughing at the bonfire pit 10 minutes earlier stood with their hands at their sides and their ears flat. I heard one of them whisper 2 words that cut deeper than anything Brett's army could carry on a banner. Humans again. I had promised these people safety. The promise was already in question. The council convened that night in my house. Maya, Hugo, Liam, and me around the table with a map I had drawn using land appraisal. Every ridge, every tree line, every footpath between the eastern hills and our valley mouth. Hugo spoke first. His fist hit the table hard enough to rattle the water cups. He said the dwarf hammer was not just for building houses. It could crush skulls just as well. He wanted a straight fight. Maya stood with her hands flat on the map. She said this was her people's home now, and if anyone tried to take it by force, she would defend it with her life. Liam, quieter than either of them, put the third option on the table. There is a passage through the eastern forest, he said. I know it. We could be gone before they arrive. Land appraisal had already annotated Brett's most likely approach. The soil compression along the main road told me where heavy cavalry would ride. And the answer was the valley mouth, because it was the only path wide enough for a column of 300. The choke points, the forest canopy, the places where the ground was soft enough to collapse under weight. Then I set the condition that decided everything. No one dies. Not on our side, not on theirs. Hugo stared at me. His jaw worked. I would prefer, he said, to solve this the way my grandfather solved it, with blood and a very large hammer. He exhaled through his nose. But you are the lord of this village, and your way has not been wrong yet. Maya's eyes were on me. She did not argue. She nodded once. I outlined the plan. Pitfall at the valley mouth. Rock and log nets at the choke points on either side. Sleep arrows from the forest. Maya's fastest runners in the canopy. Non-combatants evacuated to the caves. And Frost, on the high ground beside me, ready to end the fight if the traps were not enough. We worked through the night. By dawn, everything was in place. The sun came up. Brett's banners crested the eastern hill. I watched from the high ground with Frost on my shoulder as the column came through. 300 knights in formation. Brett at the front on a dark horse. From this distance, he looked exactly like our father. The same rigid posture, the same forward lean of a man who believed the world owed him passage. He ordered the charge. The leading horses hit the pitfall at full gallop. The ground opened and swallowed the front rank, men and animals tumbling into soft earth, bruised and tangled, but alive. The cavalry behind could not stop. The column compressed on itself, horses rearing, riders cursing, momentum gone in 3 seconds. Hugo's nets dropped. Boulders the size of barrels and logs thick as a man's waist swung from the ridge walls on braided rope, crashing into the stalled column from both sides. Knights went sideways. Horses screamed. The nets pinned riders to the ground with weight they could not lift. Arms trapped. Weapons useless. Nobody was dead. Everybody was stuck. Brett, further back, screamed an order I could not hear. The rear column split and drove into the forest, trying to flank. That was the part I had planned for. Maya's archers were already in the trees. The first sleep arrow hit a knight in the gap between his collar and his helmet. He rode 3 more paces and slid off his horse like a sack of grain. The second arrow took the man behind him. The third hit a horse, which folded its legs and lay down in the middle of the path, blocking the column. The knights could not see who was firing. The arrows came from above, from behind, from angles that should not have been possible, because rabbit beast women could move through canopy the way fish move through water, silent and fast. And by the time a knight looked up, the archer was already gone. Brett rallied what remained. He pushed deeper. More arrows. More men dropping unconscious where they sat. A knight near the back threw down his sword, tore off his helmet, and sat on the ground with his hands over his ears. 2 more followed, then 5. The formation was not retreating. It was dissolving. I looked at Frost. He was no longer a cub on my shoulder. He had grown. Not the way animals grow, the way weather grows. One moment, he was small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. The next, he was standing beside me at full height. His eyes were on the forest below. "Can you end this?" I asked. Frost did not answer with words. He answered with his lungs. The roar started low, below the range of hearing, a vibration I felt in my ribs before I heard it in my ears. Then it climbed. The sound hit the valley walls and came back doubled. The sky answered. Clouds rolled in from the north. Not gray clouds, but black, the kind that carry lightning and mean it. Thunder cracked once, sharp as a whip. Then the fog came. It did not drift. It poured. A wall of white mist rolled down from the ridgeline and flooded the forest floor in seconds, dense enough that a man could not see his own hand. The knights, already broken, disappeared into it. I heard swords clatter to the ground. I heard men calling names that no one answered. I heard one knight, somewhere deep in the fog, begin to pray. No one was hurt. Everyone was blind. I left the hill on foot, Frost at my side in his full form, and walked into the mist toward the place where Brett's signal flag had last been visible. I found him alone. The fog had separated him from his remaining knights. He was standing in a small clearing with his sword drawn, the blade glowing faintly orange through the white mist, turning his face into something that looked like a painting of a man who had already lost. He saw me. The glow of his sword brightened. I stopped 10 paces from him. "Stop hurting these people. They are my family now. Whatever you think I took from you, I did not take it. It was never yours to lose." Brett's response was the sound of his teeth grinding behind closed lips. Then it came, fury compressed into fragments, that I will not perform for you. He told me I was a disgrace, that I had thrown away the Arclight name. He called the villagers animals and said I had chosen animals over blood. I let him finish. Then I asked the question I had carried since I was 3 years old. Why do you hate me? The silence after that question lasted long enough for the fog to shift around us like breathing. Then Brett broke. Not the way a wall breaks, the way a dam breaks. He told me, in a voice I had never heard from him, raw cracked, almost childlike, that I had always stolen everything from him, that my skill had always done things he could not name, that when I was 3 and pulled him from under that boulder, he had looked at my eyes and seen something that terrified him. Not power, just a calm that should not have existed in a child that young. Creepy. He said our father loved him for the wrong reasons, and on some level, he had always known it, and that watching me build something real out of nothing was the thing he could not survive. I stood in the fog and listened to my brother tell me that his hatred had never been hatred. It had been fear. The realization did not comfort me. It did not soften anything. It just rearranged the furniture in a room I had been living in my entire life, and the room was not smaller or larger. It was the same room, seen from the other side. Brett drew his sword higher. The flame along the blade roared. He lunged. Frost was faster. The white shape came through the fog like a wall of winter. Brett's flame sword struck Frost's shoulder and shattered. The blade broke into 3 pieces that spun into the mist and vanished. The impact threw Brett sideways. He hit the ground rolling, came up on one knee, and found Frost already above him, one massive paw on his chest, pressing him flat against the earth. Brett was pinned. The fight was over. I crossed the clearing in 4 steps and placed my hand on Frost's foreleg. The muscle beneath the fur was rigid, vibrating, a low growl rolling through Frost's chest like a second heartbeat. He wanted to finish this. "That is enough," I said. Frost's growl deepened. I felt the refusal in my palm, the heat of it, the conviction. He believed the threat would return if I let it walk away. He was right. I knew he was right. My hand stayed where it was. Frost pulled back. One paw lifted. Brett lay on the ground, staring up at the space where death had been, and finding only fog. I looked at my brother. He was breathing hard, the shattered hilt still in his fist, his eyes wide with pure shock. "Leave," I said. "Take your men. Go back to the estate. Do not come near this village again." Brett said nothing. He stood. He looked at Frost. He looked at me. Then he turned and walked into the fog. The mist began to clear. Through the thinning white, I watched the knights reassemble on the eastern road, bruised, confused, banners dragging in the dirt. Not one of them was dead. Not one of mine was hurt. Brett mounted a horse and rode east without looking back. I stood in the clearing and let the last of the fog lift around me. I did not know yet whether the mercy was right. I knew only that the alternative, letting Frost finish what Brett started, would have made me the kind of man my father already was. And I had walked into the Wailing Wastes 7 months ago specifically to stop being that. The village erupted that night. Hugo tried to make me drink an entire barrel of dwarf ale. Maya's people brought out every remaining festival dish. Children who had spent the day hiding in caves ran between the bonfires chasing Frost, who had shrunk back to cub size and was tolerating the attention with the dignity of a creature who had just summoned a thunderstorm and did not feel the need to prove anything further. The celebration lasted hours. People who had been terrified that morning were dancing. Rabbit beastmen and dwarves toasted each other across a fire pit that 6 months ago had been bare dirt in the middle of a cursed wasteland. The sound of it, the laughing, the singing, the clatter of wooden cups carried across the basin and bounced off the ridge walls. And I thought, this is what they wanted to destroy, not one casualty on either side. The plan had worked exactly as designed. I stayed at the fire until the crowd thinned. Then I walked to the spring and sat on the flat stone beside it, alone, watching the moons reflected in the water. Maya came and sat beside me without asking. She did not say anything for a while. The bonfire behind us had burned down to coals, and the only sound was the spring and the crickets, and, somewhere far off, Hugo singing something in Dwarvish that sounded like a drinking song about a hammer. Then she took my hand. Not dramatically, not with a speech. She reached over and placed her hand on mine, the way you place a cup on a table, simply because that was where it went. "You could have let Frost end it," she said quietly. "You could have become your father. You did not." She paused, her ears tilted forward. "That is why we are here, Adrian. All of us." I did not answer. Her hand was warm and calloused from fieldwork, and it fit against mine the way the village fit against the basin. Not because anyone designed it, but because both things had grown into each other's shape. The firelight moved on the water. It moved when I breathed. I sat there with her hand in mine, and the village whole behind us, and I thought about the gate that had closed behind me 7 months ago, the bread on the floor, the rusty sword still at my hip. I did not think about Brett, not tonight. Tonight the village was alive and no one was dead, and for the first time in my life, I was not alone in the dark. The celebration was still warm in the village's bones when the next question arrived. I was walking the perimeter with Maya, Hugo, and Liam. Hugo pointed out where the pit traps needed redigging. Liam listed merchants who had already heard about the battle. Maya watched the tree line the way someone watches a door they expect to open again. I was not celebrating. I had spent 16 years inside the Arclight household, and I knew how the pattern worked. Defeat did not end the conversation. Defeat started a new one. Then the guard at the eastern road came running. The refugees were a mixed group: humans, a few cat beastkin, and an elderly man who looked like he had been walking for longer than his legs could account for. They carried almost nothing. I walked to the entrance with Maya. Behind the group, half hidden in a woman's cloak, were two small girls, dog beastkin, twins, matching bobbed hair, small pointed ears pressed flat against their skulls, eyes that did not blink. The elder explained in 3 sentences. They had lost their parents in the chaos before the group reached the village. They had not spoken since. I crouched down to their level. They flinched. Not the quick flinch of surprise, the slow flinch of someone who has learned that adults who come close usually bring pain. I stood back up. This village is a place where all the wounded can rest, I said. Emma, Lily, and all of you who have come here, welcome to Holy Beast Village. That night, the twins slept in a warm room for what I suspected was the first time in weeks. Their faces did not soften. They slept the way birds sleep, with their eyes not quite closed, ready to fly. I did not try to fix them. Land appraisal could tell me what was buried beneath soil, not what was buried beneath silence. So I did the only thing I understood. I showed up, and I did not ask anything. Every afternoon for a week, I sat under the oak near their house, sketching ore patterns on flat stone with charcoal. Frost sprawled beside me in cub form, belly up, tail twitching at flies. I did not look at the twins' window. I did not wave. I did not call them. Maya sewed 2 small dresses, green with white stitching along the hem, and left them folded on the doorstep without knocking. The next morning, the dresses were gone. Through the window, I saw the twins wearing them, standing side by side in front of a polished tin mirror. Their fingers touched the fabric the way you touch something you are afraid will be taken away. On the 4th day, Lily came outside. She crossed the yard in bare feet, stopped 3 paces from Frost, and stared. He opened one golden eye. She took 1 step closer, then another. Then she put her hand on his fur. "Warm," she whispered. Frost purred, low and steady, and her hand stayed where it was. 2 days later, Maya and I were checking soil near the new flower bed. The twins were behind us, not with us, not speaking, but no longer hiding indoors. They walked in our wake the way small animals follow a larger one across open ground. A butterfly crossed the path, large, blue, the color of deep water in afternoon light. Lily pointed. Her whole arm went up, and the word came out before she could stop it. "Butterfly!" Emma's voice followed, so quiet I almost missed it. "Pretty." Then they both froze. Their hands came up toward their mouths, and I saw the fear. Children who had learned that making sound earned something worse than silence. I knelt. I placed 1 hand on each of their heads. I did not say anything. I just smiled, and the smile was real. They cried. Not the kind of crying that sounds like pain, the kind that sounds like a lock opening. That night, someone knocked on my door. 2 small girls in green dresses stood on the step, holding each other's hands. "Big brother," they said together. I stood in the doorway for a long time after they left. Frost pressed his head against my jaw. The stars were the same ones I had looked at the night I arrived alone, but the silence was different now. The silence had people in it. Several weeks passed. The twins greeted me with hugs each morning. Emma was learning to plant flowers with Maya. Lily had claimed Frost's belly as her personal pillow. The village was growing. New families, new fields, the right kind of problems. Then Liam returned from a trade run with trouble on his face. Brett's defeat had become a national scandal. The Misty Rout, his contacts called it. House Arclight had slandered us to the royal family. Rebels, they said. A dangerous nest using a sacred beast as a weapon. The Crown was sending an investigation team in 1 week, led by Marcus Hale, a career bureaucrat known for cold loyalty to the king and a reputation for never telling a noble what they wanted to hear. "If he decides we are a threat," Liam said, "the next thing through that valley will not be 300 soldiers." I looked at the map and thought about the twins learning to plant flowers. "We do not hide," I said. "We show him what we are." The village spent a week preparing. Hugo displayed his finest forged tools. Maya prepared the best food from the autumn harvest. Liam compiled every trade ledger into a clean record. Even Emma and Lily picked flowers and arranged them in small clay pots near the meeting hall entrance. Marcus Hale arrived on the 7th morning with the royal crest on his banner and a delegation that marched with discipline. He dismounted, surveyed the entrance, and looked at me the way a man looks at a document he has not yet decided to sign. I bowed once, not deep, not shallow. I am Adrian Arclight, lord of this village. Welcome. He did not return the bow. He said my name back to me as if confirming a fact, then 4 words that set the tone for the day. Then, let us begin. The inquiry lasted a full day. Marcus asked about Frost first, the nature of our bond, whether the sacred beast was bound by contract, magic, or coercion. I told him the truth. Then Frost opened his eyes and sent a single telepathic pulse that hit every person in the room like a gust of warm wind. The delegation flinched. Marcus did not flinch, but his pen stopped moving. He moved to the demi-humans. Were the beastmen and dwarves slaves, wards, or subjects? They are equal partners, I said. They built this village beside me, not beneath me. He examined Liam's ledgers line by line. He inspected the forge. He walked the fields. He spoke to villagers without me present. I learned later that Hugo had told him any noble who tried to take the forge would find the furnace cold and the dwarves gone by morning. By late afternoon, Marcus sat across from me with the ledgers closed and his pen set aside. "You are an exceptional ruler," he said. One sentence. The kind of praise that costs a man like Marcus something to give, which is how I knew he meant it. Then he told me he had brought a proposal from the king. He called Maya and Hugo back into the room. The king wanted to designate our village as the Sacred Beast Special District, direct royal territory, exempt from any noble house's authority, with me as its first lord. In exchange, the crown would hold exclusive purchasing rights for everything we produced, recognition on the front, tribute on the back. I read the proposal the same way I read land, looking for what was beneath the surface. Exclusive purchasing rights meant the crown could set prices, lock them in, leave us no recourse. "We accept the proposal," I said, with 2 conditions. Marcus raised an eyebrow. First, pricing is renegotiated annually based on current market value. Not locked, not fixed. He watched me. Second, the district retains full autonomy, including the explicit right to refuse any demand from any party, including the crown, that we judge to be unreasonable. Marcus laughed. Once, short, the kind of sound that escapes a man who has been waiting to hear something specific and has just heard it. He accepted both conditions on the king's behalf. The Sacred Beast Special District was official. I walked outside after they left. The village square was gold with late sun. Emma and Lily's flower pots sat on the meeting hall steps. I was a lord now, not of House Arclight, of this place. "Gather everyone," I said. "We have a future to talk about." 3 reactions reached me over the following weeks. In the Arclight Manor, Brett received the formal notice. The exiled 3rd son was now a direct royal lord, his territory exempt from family authority. He picked up a porcelain teacup and threw it against the far wall. He did not speak. The shattered porcelain said everything his voice would not. Garrett counseled patience. He warned Brett not to provoke the royal family while the endorsement was fresh. The man who had exiled me without flinching was not the kind who acted from rage. He waited until the angle was right. That patience was more dangerous than any army. The 3rd reaction came from a man I had not yet met. Damien Hawthorne ran the largest independent trading company in the capital. When news of the special district reached him, he saw an opening, a village producing rare goods under a young lord with no political connections. Not a threat. An opportunity someone with the right leverage could crack open. He began planning. I would learn his name soon enough. The morning after the celebration, I called a meeting. The first royal delivery was due in 3 months. Maya confirmed the agricultural side was manageable. Liam confirmed the logistics route. Then, Hugo set both fists on the table. "The ore veins are there," he said. "Your skill found them, but our furnace cannot touch them. The heat we need is double what iron takes, and the impurities require magical refinement we do not have. If we import equipment, we hand our techniques to every merchant between here and the throne." Maya spoke. There was a rumor, a dwarf blacksmith living alone in the mountains to the north, a master smith who had refused contact with humans for decades. His name is Walter, Hugo added. If the rumor is true, he is the best metalworker alive, but he hates humans, every one of them. I looked at the map, the ore samples near the window. The village had water, food, people, a sacred beast, and a royal charter. What it did not have was fire hot enough to match what the land had given us. Then I will go find him, I said. Maya looked at me the way she always did when I volunteered for something she knew was going to be harder than I was admitting. But the village's next problem was the right one, and the right problems are the ones you walk toward, not the ones you wait for. Hugo told me not to bring anyone impressive. No frost, no dwarves, just you and one person who does not look like a threat. He stroked his beard the way he always did when he was sure he was right. That old dwarf will not talk to a delegation. He will talk to a boy who shows up alone and does not ask for anything yet. So Maya and I walked north for half a day. The trail thinned after the first hour. By midday, we were climbing through pines that grew sideways out of the rock. I found a hunting trap across the path, vines and counterweighted stones, expertly assembled. Whoever lived up here did not want visitors. Maya spotted the smoke first. I heard the hammering before I saw the entrance. Inside the cave, the heat hit like a wall, a furnace built into natural stone, tools arranged with decades of precision, and at the anvil, a dwarf, barrel-chested, forearms like bridge cables, a reddish-brown beard braided tight against his chest. He did not look up. I introduced myself. I told him we came from the village south of here. He told us to leave, not politely, not with room for negotiation, just a hammer lifted 2 inches off the anvil and a voice like grinding stone. I set down a bundle near the entrance, fresh vegetables, smoked meat, a small cask of fruit wine, and told him we would come back another day. Maya and I walked out into the cold and did not look back. Hugo listened to my report and laughed, not at me, at the situation. That is exactly what a dwarf does when he is interested, but does not want to admit it. He leaned forward. Did he look at the ore? For about 2 seconds. Then he is already lost. He just does not know it yet. Hugo tapped his index finger on the table. Words will not open that door, but food will. Cook something a dwarf cannot refuse. Something that says you spent half a day on his account and expected nothing back. I cooked. Borscht on the bone, sweet carrots from our own fields, onions, potatoes, herbs, rock salt, the spring water Frost had purified, black beer toward the end, and a spoon of thick fermented paste to finish. It simmered from morning until the shadows were long. I packed the pot, a fresh black loaf, and a second cask of fruit wine. This time, I walked alone. Walter was standing outside the cave, holding the empty wine cask from my first visit. He told me I was a persistent pest. I held up the pot. The lid rattled. Steam escaped. His nostrils moved before the rest of his face did. He gave me 5 minutes. Inside the forge, the stew did the talking I could not have done with 100 speeches. Walter ate in silence. The first spoonful stopped him mid-chew. He set the spoon down, looked at the pot, picked the spoon back up, and ate the rest without speaking. When the bowl was empty, he wiped his beard with the back of his hand and asked me who I was. A pioneer, I said. I was thrown out of my family's house with a rusty sword and half a loaf of bread. Now I have a village. He listened. The rest came in pieces. The exile, the sacred beast, the refugees, the dwarves. We had mithril veins and a royal contract we could not fill because our forge was not good enough for the metal the land had given us. Then Walter's face changed. He told me, in short, hard sentences, each one heavy enough to crack stone, about the lord who had invited him to forge for a noble house, how that lord had studied his techniques, copied his methods, burned his workshop, and killed his apprentices when their usefulness was over. He told me he had lived in this cave for longer than I had been alive because the alternative was trusting another human and watching it happen again. I bowed. Not the shallow bow of a greeting, the bow my mother taught me before she died, the one where your back is parallel to the ground and your hands are open at your sides. I cannot speak for every human who hurt you, I said, but I can apologize for the ones who did. What was done to you was wrong. It was not trade. It was not business. It was theft and murder, and no one in my village would ever do it. He told me to stand up. His voice was rough. I stood. I walked him outside to a rock wall 50 paces from his cave entrance. I put my hand on the stone and activated land appraisal. The rock opened in my mind like a blueprint, 50 meters straight down, a natural cavern 10 times his current workshop, magma channels beneath the floor, groundwater seeping from the ceiling, granite harder than anything in the kingdom, a forge the gods forgot to build. I described it to him. He put his own palm on the rock. Dwarves feel stone the way dogs feel weather, through something older than words. His hand stayed there for a long time. Then he sighed. It was the sigh of a man putting down something he had been carrying for 30 years. He would come, exclusively, under one condition. He trusted me, not the village, not the contract, not any future lord who might replace me. And if I broke that trust, his hammer would find me. If you betray me, he said, I will die in your forge with your name in my mouth. I accepted. His hand was rough as iron when I shook it. For the first time since I had met him, the corners of his mouth moved upward. Within weeks, the village changed shape. Walter did not ease in. He arrived like a storm front and started issuing orders before his boots were clean. The great workshop rose from the cavern Hugo's clan excavated, while Walter designed the interior with the fury of a man who had been saving blueprints in his head for decades. The first things he made were plows, a blade that halved the labor and doubled the depth. Maya drove one through soil that had broken 3 previous designs. She looked at me over the handle and grinned. Then he reworked everything: hoes, axes, knives, weapons, spears that held an edge through a full day of sparring, short swords the guards said felt lighter than air. The village had gained a craftsman worth 100 soldiers. The merchant arrived on a day when the fields were green and the forges were singing. A dozen armored mercenaries flanked him. He wore expensive cloth and gold on his fingers and looked at the village the way someone looks at furniture they intend to buy at a discount. He walked the fields without asking permission, then sat across from me in the meeting hall. Damien Hawthorne, the Hawthorne Trading Company. He wanted an exclusive contract, every product the village produced, at 30% of market price. He described it as generous. He described what would happen if we refused, slowly, the way a man describes something he has already decided to do. I refused, not with a speech, not with a threat. I told him the village decided its own terms, and his offer was not one of them. His face went through 3 colors. He said something I will not repeat and walked out with his mercenaries. The threat he left behind was not subtle. He promised I would regret this, and his voice carried the weight of a man who kept that kind of promise. Maya found me afterward. She apologized. Her rumor about Walter had put us on the road that crossed Damien's network. I told her the rumor also brought us the best blacksmith in the kingdom, and that was a trade I would take every time. I could not wait for Damien to make the next move. Economic isolation would strangle us before any sword could. Days later, I walked to Rockbridge with Maya and several young guards. The town was built into a rocky hill, stone streets, a market square loud enough to hear from the outskirts. I used land appraisal on the stalls. The skill read commerce the same way it read soil. Over 70% were tied to the Hawthorne Trading Company. Damien did not just trade in Rockbridge, he owned it. In a quiet corner, I found a small stall, clean, the products arranged with care. The appraisal read Heather Trading Post. Quality rank A, trade partners, none, revenue, struggling. The woman behind it had her hair tied back and her sleeves rolled up. She was polishing a glass bottle when I approached. I showed her 3 samples, herbs still damp with morning dew, a knife Walter had forged with a ripple pattern in the steel, and a carrot the color of sunset. The herbs made her eyes widen. The knife made her breath catch. The carrot she turned over in her hands 3 times. Then her face fell. The Hawthorne Company had been pressuring her for months. Any partnership would bring their attention faster. 3 men in Hawthorne crests appeared at the stall as if the conversation had summoned them. They told Selena she was finished here. They told me to step aside. I did not step aside. 2 of my guards moved behind the 3 men. It was over in seconds, precise, quiet, the kind of restraint that proves the point without proving anything else. Selena stared at the 3 men on the ground, then at me. I told her we had the products, the protection, and the will, together or separately. And separately was worse for both of us. Her eyes were wet when she answered. Yes, she said. I have been waiting for someone to say that. We shook hands. The Heather Trading Post had a partner. The village had a road to build. The Sacred Beast Highway was the most ambitious thing the village had ever attempted. 30 kilometers through wilderness. I walked ahead with land appraisal, charting the route, every ridge, every soft patch, every stone shelf that could serve as foundation. Behind me, Hugo's dwarves felled trees and graded earth. The rabbit beastkin cleared roots and rocks. Even the twins carried water to the crews, Emma with both hands, Lily running ahead to refill. 2 weeks in, the road was past the halfway mark. Then the rock lizards came, a pack of them, armored creatures with hides like granite. They charged from the tree line without warning. Swords bounced off their backs. I activated land appraisal mid-fight and found the weakness, thin scales at the belly and throat. I shouted it. The guards adjusted. The village finished the lizards together, and I will leave it at that. What mattered was what I found after. Livestock feed laced with a chemical compound, a monster lure. Someone had baited these creatures to this exact location. I did not say the name out loud. I did not need to. That night, I told the village leaders what land appraisal had found. Walter wanted to walk to Rockbridge and put his hammer through Damien's desk. Hugo wanted roughly the same thing, but with a bigger hammer. The anger in the room was a living thing. It pressed against the walls and rattled the candle flames. I understood the anger. I shared it, but I told them what I had told myself on the walk back from the construction site. We were citizens of the Holy Beast Special District, recognized by the Crown. The two conditions I had negotiated with Marcus, annual pricing and the right to refuse, were legal architecture that gave us standing in any court in the kingdom. If we rode to Rockbridge and broke a merchant's bones, we became the rebels House Arclight had always called us. Damien would win without lifting another finger. No violence, no retaliation. Evidence first, legal action second. And when we moved, we would move so completely that the man would never stand again. Walter stared at me for a long time. Then he grunted. It was the closest thing to agreement I had ever heard from him. Before dawn the next morning, Maya and I were on the road with several of the young guards. Maya found the trail first. Her nose caught what the eye missed, the lure's sour chemical stink threaded with blood. The scent led northwest into wild country no one had reason to travel. Land appraisal painted the wagon tracks in my mind like a line of light, poorly disguised, but the ruts were too deep to erase. The trail ended at a shallow ravine. At the bottom, a destroyed wagon, broken wheels, empty feed bags, and on the side panel, half covered in mud, but entirely readable, the emblem of the Hawthorne Trading Company, a scale and a gold coin. The feed residue matched. Maya said the company name aloud, quietly, the way you confirm something you already knew. I held a piece of the panel. The paint was still fresh enough to smudge. I brought the evidence to Selena. She examined everything and looked at me with a hardness I had not seen in her before. Her network confirmed what I suspected. Damien had been in contact with a beast tamer in the city's underworld. His henchman had been seen meeting the man twice in the last 2 weeks. I built the trap. A false rumor whispered through the grapevine that a first shipment of rare herbs and mithril tools would pass through a specific stretch of road on a specific night. Irresistible bait. We set the ambush at a cliff-lined stretch where the road narrowed to a single lane. Maya, Walter, the young guards, me. We waited in the dark. They came on schedule. The henchman handed the beast tamer a folded paper. I watched the exchange from 15 paces away. Then we closed the circle. Walter's fist ended the beast tamer's reach for his tools. The guards pinned the henchman. Maya took the paper from the ground. I opened it. Damien Hawthorne's handwriting, his signature, the attack plan, the payment terms, the target. Every word a nail in a coffin the man had built for himself. I looked up at the twin moons. Checkmate. Baron Hayward did not want to hear what I had to say. Not because he doubted me, because the Hawthorne Company supplied 20% of Rockbridge's tax revenue, and its collapse would hurt. He said as much. I told him the alternative was worse. A merchant who hired beast tamers to sabotage a royally recognized district was a liability disguised as revenue. If the crown learned Rockbridge had known and done nothing, the cost would not be measured in gold. Selena told him trust was the only currency a merchant town could not print. Tolerate this, and the honest traders leave. The town hollows from the inside. He looked at the letter for a long time. Then he decided. The emergency guild assembly filled every bench. Damien walked in the way a man walks into a room he believes he owns. He denied every charge with the confidence of someone who had never been told no twice. The evidence came out in sequence: the wagon panel, the feed bags, the beast tamer's testimony, and then the letter. Hayward held it up so the entire hall could see the signature. What happened to Damien's face was not staged. The arrogance drained first, then the color, then the posture. He claimed the letter was forged. He claimed his subordinates acted alone. Each claim hit the signature and died. Hayward pronounced judgment: permanent expulsion, company dissolved, all assets seized as compensation. Damien fell forward in his chair. His empire ended in a single sentence from a baron who had done the math. I watched it happen. No triumph, no pity, just the specific emptiness that comes after you remove a threat you should never have had to remove. The quiet knowledge that the energy spent prosecuting one corrupt merchant was energy that could have built another road. Outside the hall, Selena and I shook hands one more time. The alliance was operational. The road was clear. 1 month passed without a crisis. I almost did not know what to do with the silence. The Sacred Beast Highway opened to full traffic. Selena's wagons rolled in twice a week. The Heather trading post was no longer struggling. It was growing. Hayward visited once and told me it was the best maintained highway in his jurisdiction. I proposed a harvest festival. Maya seized the idea before I finished the sentence. Walter volunteered to forge decorative ornaments, animals and flowers shaped from scrap iron, each one polished until it caught the light. The twins led the village children through the fields, picking every wildflower within running distance. Emma carried bundles with both arms. Lily ran ahead, pointing at colors. The day before the festival, the village looked like a different place. Flowers strung between the rooftops, metal ornaments hanging from the eaves, turning slowly in the breeze. The smell of cooking drifting from every door. I climbed the hill at the edge of the village and sat down. Frost jumped from my shoulder to the grass, stretched, and settled into a warm patch of sunlight. His purring was the only sound above the wind. Below me, the village was lit by the last of the day's light. Smoke from the kitchens, children running between the houses, Maya directing the placement of a long table in the square, Walter arguing with a young dwarf about the angle of a hanging ornament, Hugo carrying a bench under each arm. I had been thrown out of my family's house with a rusty sword and half a loaf of bread. Now I was sitting on a hill watching a village prepare for a celebration in a land my father had called cursed. I did not gloat. I did not feel victorious. I felt grateful for the ordinary fact that people I cared about were safe and busy and looking forward to tomorrow. Frost opened one golden eye and looked at me. Then he closed it again. Tomorrow would be a good day. I did not know yet that the most troublesome uninvited guest was already on his way. The harvest festival opened under a sky so clean it looked painted. Hugo and the dwarves had been drinking since dawn. Their mugs rang like bells every time they clashed. The rabbit beastmen set up a circle near the bonfire and started a foot-stamping dance that shook the nearest table hard enough to rattle the plates. Emma and Lily ran through the crowd, carrying armfuls of wildflowers, tucking stems behind ears and into jacket pockets of anyone too slow to dodge them. Maya had organized the food tables with the same quiet authority she brought to everything. Fresh vegetable salad, baked potatoes with herb butter, quiche with mushrooms from the northern slope, and fruit wine from the first press. Selena stood beside her, tasting a potato and asking for the recipe with the expression of someone who had already decided to steal it. Baron Hayward found me near the bonfire and told me he had never seen this kind of harmony, not even in the capital. He pointed at the vegetable spread. The flavor, he said, was better than anything from a high-end restaurant in Rockbridge. I looked at the square, dwarves and beastmen and humans, eating from the same tables, laughing at the same jokes. Frost purred on my shoulder. For one full breath, I let myself believe that this was enough, that the land had given us everything we needed, and the world would let us keep it. Then my brother walked into the square. Brett came alone. No soldiers, no cavalry, just his navy jacket and his sword, and the expression he always wore when he looked at my village, like he had stepped in something. He made a comment about nobles living among animals. The words were pitched to carry. A few of the rabbit beastmen near the dance circle went still. Hugo's mug stopped halfway to his mouth. I opened my mouth to answer, but the sound came first. Hooves. Dozens of them, disciplined, rhythmic, the kind of cadence that only comes from trained military cavalry. The music stopped. The dancers froze. The children looked toward the road. Wallace Hightower rode into the square at the head of a column of armed cavalry, the purple and silver banners of House Hightower catching the morning light. Silver hair, purple eyes, ceremonial robes that cost more than our entire harvest. He announced himself as the king's representative, here to inspect the Sacred Beast Special District. I watched Brett's face. The blood left it in stages, first the cheeks, then the jaw, then the hands at his sides. The Hightower and Arclight houses sat on opposite sides of the kingdom's political map. Wallace's presence here was a threat to both of us, and Brett knew it before I did. Wallace's words were formal. His eyes were not. They moved across the square the way a buyer moves through a market he intends to shut down. I stepped forward. I welcomed him with the same precise courtesy I had given Marcus Hale the day the royal investigator arrived. Title, greeting, the formality of a lord receiving a superior in his own territory. I denied him the confrontation he was looking for. The festival was over. What arrived now was a kind of battle I had not fought before. Wallace spent 3 days in the village. Each day he found new things to criticize. The farmland geometry was unconventional. He suggested it reflected poor planning. The dwarven housing was inefficient. He questioned whether dwarves could be trusted to build for humans. The interspecies mixing was unstable. He predicted structural collapse within 2 years. His words were always polite. His tone never was. I walked beside him through every inspection and said nothing that could be used against me. I thanked him for each observation. I filed each one where it belonged, in the place where I kept things that did not matter. On the 3rd afternoon, Wallace found what he had actually come for, Walter's workshop. He walked through the forge slowly, running one gloved finger along the anvil. He told Walter, with the careful tone of a man offering a gift he expects to be accepted, that a blacksmith of his caliber deserved a larger workshop in the capital, with gold, honor, and the patronage of the Hightower house. Walter listened with his arms folded across his chest. He let Wallace finish. Then he spoke. I have met your kind before. Walter picked up a half-finished blade from the anvil and held it up to the furnace light. Clean hands, soft palms. You have never made a thing in your life that cost you sweat. You buy men the way you buy furniture, and when the legs break, you throw us out with the sawdust. He set the blade down. Get out of my forge. Wallace left with a vein standing on his forehead. He did not look back. That evening, Wallace called me to the hill above the village. He stood with his back to the sunset and told me the land was worthless. His report to the king would reflect it. The Sacred Beast Special District, he said, was a waste of royal attention. Then he offered me a final chance. Use my skill. Show him, right here, what the land held. Prove the value or accept the verdict. The trap was clean. Refusing would confirm his report. Complying would reveal assets to the one man in the kingdom most likely to try seizing them. I chose the partial truth. I put my hand on the ground and activated land appraisal. The reading came back deep and enormous. I named what I found, a magma chamber far below the basin, large enough to provide heat energy for generations. A vast herb field on the northern slopes containing rare medicinal plants that no alchemist in the kingdom had cataloged. Wallace's composure cracked for half a second. I saw the surprise in his eyes before he buried it. He told me, with his voice carefully flat, that he would test whether I could actually protect that value. I said nothing. He walked back down the hill. Frost was on my shoulder. I had not mentioned him. I had not mentioned what he could do. That card stayed in my hand. The next morning, Wallace gathered the village in the square. He stood beside a covered wagon his cavalry had wheeled in from the road. Brett was there. He had not left. The villagers stood in a half circle. The twins were not among them. Maya had moved them to the storehouse the moment the cavalry appeared at dawn. I did not have to ask her why. Wallace spoke. He praised the geothermal reservoir and the herb field. He acknowledged the value. Then he said the word that told me everything. Assessment. Value, he said, only means something if you have the power to protect it. He would now conduct a final assessment. His cavalry pulled the cover off the wagon. 5 meters of black steel. Articulated joints built for war. A single red eye. A high-purity magic crystal seated in the chest behind a cage of reinforced alloy. The ground shook when it stepped off the wagon bed. Brett spoke before I could. He protested, loudly, his voice cracking at the edges, that this was not an inspection, that this was a military golem, that unleashing it on a village was slaughter, not assessment. Wallace dismissed him without looking at him and cited the king's decree. I watched my brother's face. The rage was not directed at me, not this time. For the first time in my life, Brett Arclight was furious at someone on his own side of the political line, and the fury was born from something I had never seen in him before: disgust. The golem moved. Its first swing took the watchtower apart. Timber and stone exploded outward. The debris scattered across the square in a fan of splinters. Two of the young defenders dove clear. No one was hit, but the message was delivered. The village fought back. The dwarves charged with battle axes. Hugo swung from behind, putting everything he had into the blow. The axe head rang against the golem's leg and bounced. The vibration threw him back 3 steps. He looked at his hands. Maya drew her bow. 3 arrows in rapid succession, each one trailing faint magic. They struck the golem's shoulder, its chest, its neck. Everyone skittered off the armor like sparks off a grinding wheel and dissolved into nothing. Walter grabbed an iron block from the nearest workbench and hurled it. The block hit the golem's torso with a sound like a cathedral bell. It did not leave a mark. The golem swung again. Another structure came apart. The defenders fell back, weapons broken, arrows spent. Nothing had worked. I climbed the stone wall at the edge of the square. From the high ground, I could see the golem's full body. I put my hand flat on the wall and reached. Land Appraisal had read soil, minerals, water, caverns, herb fields. I had never used it on a machine, but the magic crystal in the golem's chest was a mineral. It grew in the earth the same way mithril did. It had a structure, and every structure has a frequency. The reading came back clean. Prototype military golem, high physical defense, magic crystal power source, vulnerable to resonance vibration at 7.83 Hz. Apply the frequency directly to the crystal and its internal structure collapses. Functional shutdown, 7.83 Hz. I had the number. I needed a tool that could deliver it. "Walter," I shouted from the wall. His head turned. "Mithril spike, arm length, sharp tip, thin center. It needs to ring when it is struck. 3 minutes. Can you do it?" He looked at me for 1 second. 1 second was all he needed to understand what I was asking and why. 3 minutes, he called back. "Hold the line, boy." He turned and ran for his forge. I looked at the village. Broken weapons, bruised defenders, fear on every face. And behind the fear, the thing I had bet everything on since the day I dug the first well: trust. I gave them 2 sentences. "There is a weakness. I have a plan. Hold 3 minutes." They held. The wetland east of the square was the weakest ground in the basin. I had tagged it on the first day of Wallace's inspection: soft soil, high water table, load-bearing capacity barely enough for a horse. A 5-meter golem made of black steel would not float. The young defenders understood the plan in one pass. They spread out in front of the golem and started taunting it. Shouts, thrown stones, anything to pull its attention east. The golem's intelligence was low. It obeyed the last threat it registered. It turned. It followed. Wallace watched from the hill. I could see him mutter something when the golem's path shifted, but he realized too late. The golem's right foot hit the wetland. The ground gave. The massive leg sank to the knee. The body tilted forward. The red eye swiveled, searching for a target it could no longer reach. Frost leaped from my shoulder. In the air between my collarbone and the ground, he was no longer a cub. His paws hit the earth, and his chest expanded, and he roared. Once, low, the sound rolling through the soil like a wave through water. The wetland answered. The ground beneath the golem liquefied. The second leg sank. The torso dropped. 5 meters of black steel listed sideways in the muck, like a ship losing its keel. Walter's voice cut across the field. He was sprinting from the workshop, a spike of bright metal in his hand, arm length, tapered, the center section thin as a tuning fork's prong. He threw it to Hugo. Hugo caught it in one fist. He looked at the golem. He looked at the spike. He planted his feet the way only a dwarf can plant his feet, low, wide, rooted to the planet, and threw. "Same as the iron in the forest of despair," he growled. "You hit it where the heart should be." The spike crossed the distance in a single arc and buried itself halfway into the golem's chest, exactly where the magic crystal sat behind the armor. The metal rang on impact, a clear, singing note that hung in the air. Maya knocked the arrow. Not a standard shaft, a modified arrow with a small forked metal head shaped like a tuning fork, designed by Adrian and Walter the night before the festival to break resonant stone in the northern herb caves. I had not known it would be needed for this, but the frequency was the frequency. She drew. The bowstring creaked. She released. The arrow struck the exposed end of the mithril spike. The fork vibrated. The vibration traveled down through the spike and into the crystal. 7.83 hertz, amplified through mithril, channeled directly into the power source. The crystal shattered. The golem's red eye flickered, dimmed, went dark. The articulated joints locked. 5 meters of black steel tipped forward into the wetland, with a sound like a door closing on something that would never open again. Silence. The field held its breath. The mist hung. The cattails did not move. A child shouted from behind the storehouse wall. One voice, high and sharp. Then the square erupted. Dwarves roaring, beastmen crying, humans grabbing the nearest body and holding on. The sound rolled across the village like the opposite of the golem's first step. Not destruction, but the noise a community makes when it discovers it is still alive. I stood in the middle of it. Frost shrank back to cub form on my shoulder, purring as if nothing had happened. Hugo was being carried on 2 sets of dwarven shoulders. Maya lowered her bow. Her hands were shaking. Mine were too. Wallace watched from the hill. His cavalry had not moved. His face had the expression of a man whose arithmetic has just been proven wrong in public. He mounted his horse. He said something to his officers. I could not hear the words, but the tone carried across the valley like the crack before a storm. His column turned. The purple and silver banners pulled away from the village at a controlled trot. Not a rout, a retreat with a promise stitched into it. Emma and Lily ran out from the storehouse and collided with my legs before I could brace. I crouched down. Lily buried her face in my shoulder. Emma held my hand with both of hers and did not let go. I looked up at the hill. Brett was still there. He had not followed Wallace. He had not joined the retreat. He stood on the crest with his hands at his sides. Watching the village celebrate from the distance, a person keeps when they are deciding whether to cross a line they have never crossed before. Then he started walking down. I did not know what he was coming to say. I did not know if I was ready to hear it. But the winter between us, the one that had started with a rusty sword and half a loaf of bread scattered on a stone floor, felt for the first time like it might have a spring on the other side. I waited. The cheering from the square below sounded far away. I climbed the hill with Frost on my shoulder, his small body warm against my neck, his purr the only steady sound I could find. Wallace stood at the crest where he had watched the whole thing. His cavalry waited behind him, banners limp in the still air. Brett stood 10 paces to Wallace's left, arms at his sides, looking at neither of us. Wallace turned as I reached the top. His face had gone past fury into something colder. He told me, through his teeth, that the sacred beast trick would not save me a second time, that the district I had been granted existed only because the crown had not yet found it worth reclaiming, that he would personally see to it that every lord in the kingdom understood what I was building here and what it threatened. The words came out measured and precise, like a man dictating a letter he had already composed in his head on the ride up. I told him the village's strength was its people. I said it plainly, without raising my voice. The golem had not been defeated by any single trick. It had been defeated by a blacksmith, a dwarf chief, a rabbit beast woman with a bow, and a sacred beast who chose to stand with them. That was all. Wallace could not hold a face against a calm answer. The composure broke. He called my people animals, and called me the worst kind of noble, the kind who kneels to the dirt he stands on. He swore he would return the humiliation tenfold. Then he turned to his cavalry, barked the order, and they rode east at a pace that kicked dust across the hilltop for a full minute after they vanished. I watched until the last purple banner disappeared past the eastern tree line. The threat was real. Wallace had political channels I could not see, connections in the capital that ran deeper than any letter Marcus Hale could write on my behalf. The shadow he left behind was longer than the man. Brett had not moved. The silence between us stretched the way silences do when neither person knows who owns the first word. Frost shifted on my shoulder and settled. Below us, the village was singing. Someone had started a drum. The harvest festival had survived a war machine and was refusing to stop. The sound of it reached the hilltop like music heard through a wall, present, but not quite mine. Brett broke the silence. He asked me how I had done it. Not the tactics, not the spike, not the frequency. He asked how the demi-humans fought for me. He said the word demi-humans, the way someone says a word they have been told their whole life means one thing and have just discovered means another. His voice was not not mocking. It was not cold. It was the voice of a man standing at the edge of a concept he did not have a place for. I told him the truth. I said I had trusted them, and they had trusted me. That was the whole of it. No binding contract of loyalty, no threat, no leverage. I had dug the well, they had come. I had offered them an equal place. They had stayed. When the golem came, they fought because the village was theirs too. Brett was quiet for a long time after that. He looked down at the square where Hugo was being carried on dwarven shoulders, where Maya was standing with her bow still in her hand, where Emma and Lily were running between the tables with flowers they had picked from somewhere. He said the word trust again, quietly, as though testing whether it fit in his mouth. He told me he had been raised to believe that strength was the only thing that earned loyalty, that a lord commanded and subjects obeyed, and the distance between those two positions was the entire architecture of the world. He said his father had taught him that. He said every tutor, every knight captain, every ceremony he had attended had reinforced it. He said the lesson had always felt true because no one around him had ever offered an alternative. He paused. The wind picked up for a moment, carrying the smell of roasted grain from the festival below. Frost's ears twitched. Brett said he had watched a rabbit beast woman fire an arrow through a golem's chest to save a village she had no obligation to defend. He said he had watched a dwarf who lived alone in a mountain forge for decades run to build a weapon not for a king's order, but because a boy asked him to. He said he had watched children who could not read, yet stand at the edge of a battlefield and refuse to leave because this was their home. He said those things did not fit inside the lesson he had been taught, and if the lesson could not contain them, the lesson was wrong. I did not answer. There was nothing to add that would not diminish what he had just said. Frost's purr filled the gap. Brett turned to face me. His eyes were not the sharp, dark eyes I remembered from the back gate. They were darker, but not with cruelty, with something I had never seen in them before. Wait, I was wrong about you. Your way is valid. The words hung in the morning air between us like a held breath released. I did not say I forgive you. I could not say it honestly, and saying it dishonestly would have dishonored us both. The wound from the back gate was not the kind that closed on command. It was the kind that closed on its own time, the way soil settles over a buried stone. I did not know if it had closed yet. I did not know if it would. I told him I had heard him. I said it the same way I had bowed at the back gate the day he took the family-crest dagger from my hip and kicked my bread across the floor. Same composure, same posture, but the direction was different. At the back gate, I had been walking away from everything I had known. On this hill, I was standing on everything I had built. Brett nodded. He promised me he would report the truth of what he had seen to our father and to the king. He said he would support the Holy Beast Special District with his own testimony. He said whether Garrett listened was Garrett's choice, not his. He could not control the old man. He could only tell him what he had watched with his own eyes. He said goodbye, not the way he had said it at the back gate, as a dismissal. He said it the way people say it when they know they may not see each other for a long time, and the silence between meetings will be different from the silence that came before. He turned and walked down the hill toward the eastern road where his horse waited. I watched him go. His back, framed against the brightening sky, looked smaller than I had ever seen it. Not physically. Brett was still the same tall, broad-shouldered young man who had scattered my bread on the floor a year ago, but the symbol had shrunk. The antagonist had contracted into a person, and persons are always smaller than the shapes we give them in our worst memories. Frost purred once, low and steady, against my neck. I stood on the hill a while longer after Brett disappeared past the eastern bend. The festival sounds rose from the square like warm air. I did not know what to do with the feeling in my chest. It was not joy. It was not relief. It was not closure. It was something quieter than all three. The long winter between my brother and me was ending, and the spring that replaced it was not dramatic. It was just less cold. The festival lasted into the evening. By the time the last drum stopped and the last lantern guttered out, the square smelled like ash and honey wine and victory. I slept 3 hours and woke before dawn with a thought I could not put down. I had watched Emma and Lily playing with the dwarf children and the rabbit children in the square the night before. They had been laughing in a circle, passing a stick between them, making up rules to a game that did not exist yet. None of them could read. None of them could write their own names. None of them knew the shape of the continent they lived on, or the history of the kingdom that had decided their worth before they were born. The The battle against the golem had been won by trust and teamwork, and a 3-minute sprint to a forge, but it had also been won by knowledge. I had known the frequency because land appraisal had shown it to me, and I had known what to do with the frequency because I understood what resonance meant. Walter had known how to forge a mithril spike in 3 minutes because he had spent decades learning his craft. Maya had known how to hit a target under pressure because she had practiced. Knowledge was the foundation underneath every act of trust. Without it, trust was just a group of brave people standing in front of something they could not defeat. The village needed a school. I gathered Maya, Walter, Hugo, and Selena at the meeting hall the next morning. The table still had festival crumbs on it. I brushed them aside and laid out the proposal: a school, reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, for every child in the village, regardless of species or status. Human children, dwarf children, rabbit beast folk children, dog beast folk children, the same classroom, the same lessons, the same future. Selena leaned forward with her hands on the table and said knowledge was the one resource that multiplied when you shared it. She offered to order paper, ink, and textbooks through her contacts in Rockbridge. Walter looked at the table for a long moment and then said he would build the desks. Hugo grunted. It was the kind of grunt that, from Hugo, meant yes. I turned to Maya. I told her I wanted her to be the first teacher. The room went quiet. Maya's ears went straight up, the way they did when something caught her off guard. She said she had never taught before. She said she did not know if she was the right person. Then she stopped mid-sentence, closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the hesitation was gone. "Please let me do it," she said. "I want to." The 4 words carried more than a decade of refugee roads and lost fathers and borrowed shelters. Maya had spent her whole life being taught by the world that her people's survival was the ceiling. Teaching the next generation that their future could be higher than survival was the answer to a question she had been carrying since before she arrived at my camp with 30 starving refugees and a handshake. The meeting broke apart into logistics within minutes. Selena pulled out a trade ledger and started listing suppliers. Hugo went to find his crew. Walter left the hall without a word, and I found him 2 hours later in the workshop, already shaping the first desk. It was child-sized. The corners were rounded. Every edge had been sanded smooth, the way you sand wood when the person sitting at it matters more than the speed of the work. Walter had lived alone in a mountain forge for decades. He had refused human contact. He had eaten alone, slept alone, worked alone, and now he was rounding the corners of a desk so a child he had never met would not bruise her elbow on it. I did not say anything. I just watched him work for a few minutes and then left. Some things do not need commentary. They need witness. 1 week later, the meeting hall looked like a different building. The walls had been painted white. The floor had been sanded and polished until the grain showed through like veins in a leaf. Walter's desks stood in 3 neat rows, each one paired with a chair whose back was shaped to fit a small body. The desks were a mix of oak and iron pine, the 2 woods the village had in abundance. Each one was slightly different. Walter had refused to use a template. Maya stood at the front of the room in her clean green tunic, her rabbit ears straight and still, her hands clasped behind her back the way someone clasps their hands when they are trying not to let anyone see them shake. She had stayed up half the night preparing. I had seen the candle burning in her window past midnight. The children filed in. Emma and Lily took seats in the front row. A dwarf boy sat beside them. 3 rabbit beast folk children sat behind. 2 more human children from the outer farms filled the last row. None of them separated by species. None of them told where to sit. They chose their own seats, and the choices they made drew no lines. Maya took a breath. She told them that this room was a place of learning for all children. She said knowledge was the light that lit their future, and she would walk beside them as they carried it. Her voice shook on the first sentence and steadied on the second. Emma looked up at Maya and called her teacher. The word came out small and clear, the first time anyone in the village had used it. Lily echoed it a heartbeat later, the way Lily always echoed Emma, half a step behind, but arriving at the same place. I stood at the back of the room and watched for a few minutes. The equal contract I had written on a handshake the day Maya's refugees arrived had become a principle. The principle had become a village. And now, the village was becoming a classroom where a rabbit beast woman taught a dwarf boy and 2 dog-eared orphans how to write the letter A on a piece of paper that a human merchant had ordered from a human city so that children of every race could learn the same alphabet. Martha would have liked this room. She had taught me about plants and soil with her hands in the dirt and her voice low and patient, the way Maya's voice was now. The gardener my father had fired for being too close to me would have sat in the back row beside me and cried without making a sound. I left the classroom before anyone saw my face and walked into the morning light. That night, we built a fire in the square. The school was open. The first lesson was done. The children were home, asleep or pretending to be. The village had gone quiet the way it always did after dark, the insects and the distant river replacing the voices. Maya, Walter, Hugo, Selena, and I sat around the fire close enough to share its heat. The autumn had turned the air sharp. The stars were clearer here than they had ever been in the capital because the capital had lanterns on every corner and the light pushed the sky away. Here, the sky came all the way down to the treetops. Walter drank from a clay mug of ale and stared at the fire. He had not spoken in 20 minutes. That was Walter's natural state. But tonight, the silence had a different shape. It was not the silence of a man who did not want to talk. It was the silence of a man deciding whether to. He cleared his throat. He said it was strange, working for a human kid. He said he had spent most of his life refusing to work for anyone. And now, here he was, building desks for children he had not met 6 months ago. He said life was full of surprises, and most of them were bad, but this one was not. My dream, he said, is to be an active blacksmith until the day I die, and to forge something legendary with these hands before I do. The words came out low and rough, the way Walter said everything, but the roughness could not hide what was underneath. He had never said a personal want out loud in decades. The fire crackled in the gap after he finished, and no one filled it. The gap was his. Selena smiled. She set her tea down on the log beside her and folded her hands in her lap. She said her father had left her the heather trading post and a set of ledgers and nothing else. She said she had spent the years since his death trying to make the name mean something beyond survival. My dream is to expand the heather trading post across the kingdom and spread honest commerce to every corner of it. She looked at me after she said it and thanked me for the partnership. She said meeting me had been the first step she had taken that felt like forward motion instead of holding ground. The firelight caught the earnest in her blue eyes, and I nodded because words would have been clumsy there. Maya sat beside me with her knees drawn up and her ears tilted forward the way they tilted when she was listening more than she was thinking. She was quiet for a long time after Selena finished. The fire popped twice. "I do not have a grand dream yet," she said. Her voice was softer than usual, but watching the children today, I realized what I want. I want to protect their future. I want them to grow up knowing they can become anything, and I want to be standing beside them when they do. She did not look at me when she said it. She looked at the fire. The blush on her cheeks was not from the heat. Hugo sat across the circle with his mug balanced on his knee. He did not speak. He did not name a dream. The absence was not awkward. Hugo's dream was the work. It was always the work. He had built a forge and a wall and a series of traps that stopped an army, and he would build whatever came next, and the building was the dream. He did not need to say it out loud. Everyone at the fire understood. The circle turned to me. The fire shifted. A log collapsed inward and sent sparks into the dark sky. "My dream," I said, "is to make this village a true paradise, a place where every race and every past is respected, and everyone who lives here can wake up smiling." The word paradise hung in the air, the way Brett's apology had hung on the hilltop that morning. It was the kind of word that sounded beautiful and cost everything. Paradise was what people built when they were willing to defend it against everyone who believed paradise was not allowed. I knew that. I said it anyway. The fire burned lower. The conversation drifted into smaller things, the kind of quiet talk that happens between people who have said the large thing and are resting in its shadow. Walter refilled his mug. Selena adjusted her cloak. Maya's shoulder brushed mine once, and neither of us moved away. One by one, they left. Hugo first, with a grunt that meant goodnight. Selena next, with a wave and a smile. Walter stood, looked at the fire, looked at me, and nodded once before walking to his workshop. Maya was the last. fast. She stood and looked down at me for a moment, her ears soft and low, and said goodnight in a voice that carried more than the word. Then she was gone, and the square was empty, and the fire was mine. I did not go to bed. I sat on the log and watched the fire die, the way fires die when no one feeds them, slowly and without complaint. The embers glowed orange against the dark ground. The stars turned overhead in their slow wheel. The village slept around me, every house dark, every chimney cold, every window a black square against the gray walls. I thought about the gate a year ago. The boy who had walked through it would not recognize this square. He would not recognize the forge, the meeting hall that was now a school, the rows of houses where dwarves and rabbit beast folk and dog beast folk and humans slept under the same sky. He would not recognize the campfire where 4 people had named their dreams aloud and meant every word. He would not recognize the hill where his brother had apologized and he had answered with the same composure he had used for the disownment, because that composure was the only thing he had carried through the gate that had not rusted or torn or been kicked across the floor. I had not lost anything when I walked through that gate. I had been freed from a cage I had not known was a cage until I stood outside it. Everything I had found since then, I had found by putting my hands in the dirt and trusting the dirt to answer. The voice of the land, the trust of the people, the steady purr of a sacred beast who had chosen me for reasons I still did not fully understand. A weight settled on my shoulder. Frost. He had appeared from the darkness the way he always did, without sound, without warning, as if the night had simply decided to hand me a companion. He was in cub form, small enough to fit in the curve of my neck, warm enough to push back the autumn chill. His golden eyes found the eastern horizon and held it. I looked where he was looking. The deep blue above the tree line had begun to lighten. A band of pale gold was spreading along the edge of the world, thin and fragile, the way all beginnings are thin and fragile before they become the thing they were always going to be. The village was still. The embers glowed. Frost watched the sky. I watched the sky. The light spread. The gold deepened. The first true ray broke over the eastern hills and touched the top of the meeting hall, the school, the place where Maya had stood that morning and called the children to their future. The ray moved down the white wall and across the square and reached the campfire where I sat. And for a moment, the whole village was painted in the color of a new day, a new dawn over the Holy Beast village. Not an ending, a beginning that had taken a year of digging and building and trusting and losing and refusing to turn around to earn. Frost purred once against my neck. I reached up and rested my hand on his small warm head. The sun climbed, the village woke, and I sat where I was, on a log beside a dead fire, watching the light arrive, because for the first time in my life, I did not need to be anywhere else. The knife turned in my hand, and the wood turned with it. A horse for Emma, because she had asked for one that morning with the kind of seriousness only a child can bring to a request about a toy. A tiger for Lily, because she wanted everything Frost-shaped and would not accept a substitute. Frost sat on the bench beside me, cub-sized, his tail curling around a pile of shavings. The twins sat cross-legged in the grass with their collection growing between them. Emma held her new horse up to the sunlight and studied the mane I had carved with 3 careful strokes. Lily was already comparing her tiger to the real thing, holding the wooden figure next to Frost's face, and frowning because the horn was too short. The schoolyard was quiet. Behind me, the water wheel turned at the river, steady as a pulse. Beyond the fence, a traveling merchant I did not recognize was leading his cart along the paved road, stopping every few paces to stare at the shops and the children of 5 different races playing together in the square. He bought a jar of jam from a rabbit beastman vendor and stood there eating it with his eyes wide open, as though he had walked into a painting and could not decide whether to believe it. I carved a small bear and set it with the others. The village was running, not because I pushed it, but because the people inside it had decided to make it run. Hugo had finished the water wheel 3 weeks ago, and when he showed it to me, he had not asked for praise. He had asked what I wanted built next. That was the difference between a village and a collection of tents. Maya and I found Hugo in his workshop arguing with Sarah over a metal bottle. The argument was loud and involved hand gestures, and at least 2 insults from Hugo's personal vocabulary of metallurgical profanity. Sarah, the rabbit beast man elder who ran the village pharmacy, was giving back as good as she got, shaking a bundle of dried herbs at him like a weapon. Hugo saw us and grinned. He held up a plain iron bottle with a rune circle etched into the base and a magic stone set into the cap. He called it the auto-heating potion bottle, a collaboration between dwarven runecraft and rabbit beastman herbalism. Pour a liquid in, touch the stone, and it held the temperature for hours. Sarah explained why it mattered. The sleep herb extract the village used for fevers lost its effect below a certain warmth. In winter, by the time a dose crossed the village, it was cold and half useless. The bottle fixed that, Hugo demonstrated. 2 hours after pouring, the tea was still warm and tasted freshly brewed. Maya took the bottle in both hands. She held it the way someone holds a thing that matters more than its weight. Her ears pressed forward, and her eyes went bright. "This means Emma and Lily never have to be cold and sick through another winter," she said. "This means no child in this village does." She hugged the bottle against her chest, and her eyes were wet. Hugo looked away. Sarah adjusted her herbs. Some moments do not need commentary. They just need room. Days later, the final design was unveiled. A product no workshop in the capital could replicate, born from the simple fact that the village's people talked to each other. The pride lasted until the elf messenger arrived. He came at a run, which was unusual. Liam's people moved at the pace of commerce, not urgency. The messenger dropped to one knee and held out a sealed parchment. His face told me the contents before I broke the wax. I read it aloud. The Arclight territory was in crisis. Crops at less than a third of normal yield. Mines depleting. Water sources dropping to levels no one alive had seen. The common people were whispering that the land itself was dying. Maya's ears went flat. Hugo set his jaw. I folded the parchment. The village's bright afternoon had acquired a shadow, and the shadow had the shape of a house I no longer belonged to. When a family's land begins to die, the family looks for someone to blame. And the someone they had always blamed was standing in a schoolyard holding a carving knife. The Arclight territory was falling apart. This was not something I witnessed. It was something I learned later from Liam's network and from reports that filtered through the trade routes like smoke through a cracked wall. But what happened in that castle shaped everything that came after, so I will tell it the way I came to understand it. Garrett sat at the head of the council table. His vassals stood along both sides with the faces of men watching a house burn and waiting for the Lord to tell them where the water is. The reports were grim. The common people were speaking openly now, not in whispers, but in full sentences, that the land was dying. Garrett listened. He asked if that was all. The question sounded like a door closing. Brett stood at his father's right hand. He dismissed the reports. He called the crop failure and the water shortage trivial matters, beneath the dignity of House Arclight. He said the words with the confidence of a man who has never carried a bucket of water in his life and does not intend to start. The meeting ended. The vassals filed out in silence. Brett went to his room. He read a spy report that named the village's achievements one by one. The trade partnership with the crown, the dwarven canals, the auto heating bottle no capital workshop could replicate. He crushed the parchment in his fist. What happened next was the thing I had hoped his hilltop apology had made impossible. But an apology spoken under no pressure is not the same as one held under the weight of a collapsing world. Brett had meant what he said to me that morning. I believe that. But honesty under zero pressure is the cheapest kind. The expensive kind is honesty under structural collapse, when the frame you were raised inside is the only frame that offers you an answer, and the answer is wrong. And you take it anyway, because the alternative is admitting that everything you were trained to be is the cause of the problem. He went to Garrett's office without knocking. He proposed that the family collect wealth from the Holy Beast village, framing it as legitimate tribute. He called my refusal to comply rebellion. He called me a jinx, a parasite drawing the territory's fortune into cursed land. Garrett agreed, not because he believed the logic, because the territory's decline had stripped him of every option except the one his eldest son was handing him. The narration I owe Brett is this: the apology was real, and the reversal was also real, and neither one cancels the other. People are not single decisions. They are the weight of every decision pressing against the frame they were built inside. Brett's frame held for one morning on a hilltop. It did not hold through the winter. I was back in the schoolyard, carving. The twins were beside me. Frost was asleep on the bench. The afternoon was the kind that tricks you into believing nothing will change. The hoofbeats came from the east. 10 horsemen rode into the village square wearing the arc-light crest. They did not dismount. They did not greet anyone. They rode through the market as though the people on either side of the road were furniture. The lead rider carried himself like a man enjoying an assignment he knew was cruel. He demanded the village leader by name. I set the knife down. I told Emma and Lily to stay with Maya. I walked to the square. I introduced myself calmly. The official looked down at me from his horse. He called me the failed third son, commented on my appearance as though cataloging evidence for a verdict already reached. The mockery was performance. He was speaking to his horsemen, not to me. Maya was behind me. I felt her step forward before I saw it. Her hand was moving toward her bow. I raised one hand, palm flat, without turning around. She stopped. He unrolled a scroll sealed with the arc-light crest and read it in a voice designed to carry across the entire square. Marquis Garrett Arclight commanded the Holy Beast Village to deliver 70% of its total annual production, all mineral ore, all harvest, all manufactured goods, as tribute. Refusal within 3 days would be classified as rebellion. 70%, not 30, not 50, 70. The square erupted. Hugo stepped forward with his hammer. The dwarves growled. The rabbit beastmen villagers cried out. I did not move. Silence was the only answer that denied the official what he wanted. He threw the scroll at my feet. 3 days. Then he turned his horse, and the 10 of them rode east at speed, leaving dust and silence behind them. Hugo's knuckles were white on his hammer. Maya's hand was near her bow. I looked at the scroll in the dirt. Then I heard it, a small sound. Not a shout, not a curse, not the crack of a weapon. A soft, broken, hiccuping cry from behind Maya's legs. Emma first, then Lily, half a breath later, the way she always echoed her sister. They had been hiding behind Maya through the whole scene, pressed against her legs, ears flat against their skulls. Now that the danger had passed, the fear came out the only way children know how to release it. My knuckles were white on the scroll. The mockery had not reached me. The demand had not reached me. 70% was a number, and numbers could be refused. But the sound of those two girls crying in the dust because men on horses had come to take everything their new family had built, that reached me. That settled in the place where the decisions are made. I picked up the scroll. That night, the village's only tavern was full. The men came in angry and stayed angry. A young dwarven blacksmith slammed his ale mug on the table hard enough to crack the wood. He wanted to know what gave a marquis the right to demand 70% of something he had not built, had not watered, had not planted, had not bled for. A dog beastman hunter spoke next. His voice was quiet, which made the words land harder. He had lived under human lords before. He had been called livestock. He had come to this village because a boy with a rusty sword had told him he was a person, not property. He was not going back to that. The tavern owner wiped down the counter and let the anger run its course. Then he spoke. That boy is still in this village, he said. And while he is here, nothing that comes from the east changes what we built. The room went still. The dwarven apprentice set down his mug. The hunter unclenched his fist. The anger did not disappear. It changed shape. It went from the kind that breaks things to the kind that holds. The next morning, the market women were quieter than usual. They whispered at their stalls. They glanced at the eastern road. They held their children closer. The fear was the kind that sits in the hands and makes the routine heavier. A rabbit beastman mother, small and sturdy, holding her toddler against her hip, stopped in the middle of the lane. She looked at the women around her and spoke clearly. When we first came here, she said, we had nothing. No food, no roof, no promise that tomorrow would come. He gave us all 3. He is still here. So are we. The toddler grabbed at her ear, and she shifted him to the other hip without breaking eye contact. One by one, the women turned back to their work. The whispers stopped. The hands steadied. Maya watched from the meeting hall steps. The village had spoken for itself. She turned and walked up the steps. 4 of us sat at the table: Hugo, Maya, Liam, me. Hugo spoke first because Hugo always spoke first when the answer was obvious. He said the dwarves were ready. If it came to fighting, every forge in the village would be making weapons by nightfall. Maya looked at me. Her eyes were steady. She said she would defend the village and she would defend me. Her voice did not waver on the word cost. Liam set his tea down down and folded his hands. "This is not a disaster," he said. "This is the best opportunity this village has had since the day you dug that well," he explained. If the village repelled the aggression, it would no longer be a curiosity on the frontier. It would be a power. The tribute demand was grotesque, but the refusal, handled correctly, would rewrite every political calculation in the capital. I listened. Hugo's calloused hands flat on the table, Maya's bow leaning against the wall, Liam's tea going cold, because for once, the elf had forgotten to drink it. Past them, I saw the twins' faces, tear-streaked in the dust. The men in the tavern, angry and then steady. The women in the market, afraid and then resolved. Every person who had come to this village because someone told them they were worth a place. They were my family. The words settled in my chest the way a stone settles at the bottom of a well, quietly, completely. The scroll came up in my hands. The arclight seal, the two crossed swords I had grown up under. I tore it in half. The sound was small and clean. Hugo grunted. Maya exhaled. Liam raised one eyebrow and picked up his tea. Not just refuse. Sever. A clean sheet of parchment. A pen. The letter was short. I could not accept demands from a house that did not care for its people. I was severing all ties with the Arclight family. The villagers were my family. Those who did not care for the people they ruled had no right to rule them. I asked to be left alone. I folded the parchment and sealed it with wax. I did not use the Arclight crest. I pressed my thumb into the wax instead. Maya's hand rested on my shoulder. Hugo nodded once. Liam finished his tea. At dawn, I gave the letter to a courier and told him to ride east. He took the parchment, looked at my face, and left at a run. 3 days later, the courier returned to Arclight Castle. The messenger knelt in the audience hall, pale-faced, and produced a simple parchment instead of the sealed scroll Garrett had expected. A stir ran through the vassals, like wind through dry grass. Brett snatched the parchment and read it aloud. His voice started controlled and ended somewhere between a shout and a scream. He shredded the letter with both hands, and the pieces fell around his boots like snow. Garrett did not move. The narration I owe him is this. For one moment, he recognized what he had done. Not the exile, not the demand. The years before both. The years of not seeing that the quiet boy in the back of every room had been building something with the patience he had mistaken for weakness. For one moment, he saw the faces of his own serfs, exhausted, watching their wells go dry. For one moment, the accusation landed where it was aimed. Then, his pride closed over the recognition the way ice closes over a lake. The surface smoothed. The depth disappeared. He announced the formation of a punitive force, 3,000 troops. Brett volunteered as commander. Garrett told him, coldly, that a second failure would not be forgiven. Brett accepted without flinching. The army mobilized. The next morning, it departed through the eastern gate of Arclight Castle at dawn. The same gate I had walked through the day I was exiled. The same stones. The same road stretching east into land the room had called cursed. 3,000 soldiers heading toward a village of farmers and craftsmen and children who had learned to call a stranger Big Brother. The gate closed behind them. The difference was that I had not turned around. Liam found us at dawn. He walked into the square the way he always delivered bad news, like a man commenting on a change in the weather. 3,000 soldiers, he said. Brett commanding. 5 days east and closing. Hugo cracked his knuckles. He said we had beaten them before, and we would beat them again. Same traps, same fog. He said it with the kind of confidence that comes from winning once and assuming the pattern repeats. Not this time. The enemy Brett brought the first time numbered 300. This was 10 times that. They had been humiliated once, and they would not walk into the same forest expecting the same tricks. Old tactics against a prepared enemy would get people killed. The square was still empty. Maya stood beside me with her hand on the hilt of her knife, listening. Frost sat on my shoulder, ears flat. Hugo and Maya gathered every villager in the square, every dwarf, every rabbit beastman, every cat beastman, every human, everyone who called this place home. They came in minutes. The square filled the way water fills a bowl, from the edges inward. Some of them looked afraid. Others looked too confident, still riding the memory of 300 nights running from the fog. Both kinds worried me. I stood on the step in front of the meeting hall and looked at them. I did not give a speech. I said 2 things. I told them I was afraid, and I told them no one was going to die. Not on our side, not on theirs. Then I explained the plan. Over 100 non-lethal traps built by Hugo's dwarves. Maya's rabbit beastman squad hitting the supply lines, not the soldiers. Frost shrouding the forest in fog when the army was exhausted enough to break. The goal was not to fight them. The goal was to make 3,000 men decide, one by one, that going home alive was worth more than any order their commander had given. The square was quiet for a moment. Then a dwarf in the back row raised his hammer and roared, and the sound spread through the crowd the way fire spreads through kindling. Every voice in the square joined it. The war cry hit the rooftops and scattered the birds from the oak tree, and I stood on the step and let it wash over me because it was the only answer I needed. The dwarves treated it like a festival. Hugo rallied his crew at sunrise the first morning and told them this was not preparation for war. This was the greatest exhibition of dwarven craftsmanship the world had ever been invited to attend, and any knight who survived it would spend the rest of his life telling stories about what the short people with the hammers could do. They cheered like he had announced a holiday. I provided the terrain. My land appraisal gave us a three-dimensional map of every slope, every root system, every layer of shale and clay beneath the topsoil. I walked the forest with Hugo and pointed out where the ground would collapse cleanly under weight, where roots ran shallow enough to anchor a net, where a slope hid slick rock that would turn into a slide with a little oil. Hugo planned the placements like a man arranging pieces on a board. Pitfalls lined with slippery fruit the children had gathered by the basketful. Nets dropped from the canopy, weighted with biting insects. Choke points rigged with pouches of tear-inducing pollen that burst when a tripline snapped. Pendulum logs calibrated to startle, not strike. And in the deepest sections, caches of laughing mushroom spores that would turn the air into something that made grown soldiers giggle until they could not stand. The children helped. Rabbit beastman children carried leaves for camouflage. Cat beastman children collected the insects in jars, competing over who could gather the most. A boy with spotted ears held up a jar packed to the rim and grinned at me as if he had won a prize. Days passed. By the third morning, the forest no longer looked like a forest. It looked like something a very creative and very angry toymaker had built for people he did not like. Hugo stood at the ridge above the main trail on the final evening, his hammer resting on his shoulder, and surveyed the work. Over 100 traps, every path a question with a wrong answer. Not bad, he said, and his beard twitched with something that was not quite a smile. Welcome to the forest of despair. Maya trained her squad in the deep forest where the beast trails ran. She told me about it afterward in short sentences with no decoration. 10 rabbit beastmen, the fastest and quietest the village had. She had them scatter on her signal and reassemble at a landmark within half a minute. Then the supply raid drill. One team immobilized wagon wheels with vine wraps. A second created noise diversions to pull sentries away. A third stripped the food sacks and vanished before the sentries turned back. By the third day, they could do it in tens of seconds. First signal to last sack gone, faster than a man could draw his sword. They are ready, Maya said. Her ears were swept back, and her eyes had a sharpness I had only seen once before. The night Brett's 300 had come. Every one of them knows why we are here. Liam came to me that evening with a rolled parchment and the expression of a man who had found the last piece of a puzzle. His network had been feeding him reports for days. Disguised merchants, traveling bards, a few elves walking alongside the arclight column. The army's morale was low. Over half were green recruits, conscripted for numbers. The veterans who had survived the first campaign were the most afraid because they remembered the fog. He unrolled the parchment on the desk. Entry points, trap zones, the army's probable route. He pointed to a spot 1 hour's march past the tree line. Trigger the first trap here, he said. Not at first contact. Let them walk for 1 hour. Let the vanguard exhaust itself on the terrain. Let the rear lose sight of the front. At the 1 hour mark, they will be at peak fatigue and peak isolation. That is the moment their minds are softest. He was right. An army that hits a trap at first step braces for more. An army that walks for an hour without incident starts to believe the forest is safe. The first trap after an hour of silence would shatter the only thing holding them together, which was the belief that they understood where they were. I agreed. Day 5. The Arclight army entered the forest in the early afternoon. 3,000 men in column formation, armor glinting where the canopy broke. Brett rode at the head. Even from the high ground, I could read the set of his jaw. He believed quantity was a strategy. Hugo crouched beside me on the ridge. Maya's squad was already in position along the supply route. Frost sat on my shoulder, golden eyes half half closed, waiting. The army marched for 1 hour. Nothing happened. The silence worked on them, the way Liam had predicted. The rear ranks relaxed. The spacing between units stretched. The forest was quiet, and the quiet was the trap before the traps. At the 1 hour mark, the vanguard stepped onto the camouflaged plate over the first pitfall. The plate gave way. A dozen men dropped into a pit and landed on a carpet of slippery fruit. Their legs went out. Their hands grabbed at the walls, and the walls were slick with the same fruit, mashed into paste. They screamed, but the screaming was surprise and indignity, not pain. Behind them, the second trap triggered. Nets fell from the canopy and tangled the next rank in sheets of woven rope studded with biting insects. The soldiers thrashed and the insects bit, and the thrashing made the biting worse. And the sound that came out of 20 armored men trying to escape a net full of bugs was not a sound any military training manual had prepared them for. Then the tear spores. Pouches burst in the choke points, and clouds of yellow pollen filled the air. Eyes streamed, noses ran. Knights who had been trained to hold formation against cavalry charges stumbled sideways, blind and choking, into trip lines that pulled more nets down on top of them. And then, in the rear, where the canopy was thickest and the air was still, the laughing mushroom spores drifted through the ranks. The effect was not instant. It crept. One soldier started to giggle, then another. Then a cluster of them were laughing uncontrollably, tears running down their faces from the spores and from the laughter, while the soldiers in front of them were screaming in the pits, and the soldiers beside them were fighting the nets. The sound of an army laughing and screaming at the same time is not a sound I will forget. Hugo watched it from the ridge with his arms folded. His beard twitched. He said nothing, but his eyes were bright. Maya's squad hit the supply train while the traps held the army's attention. I learned the details later. 10 rabbit beastmen immobilized the wagon wheels with vine wraps. 2 created noise diversions that pulled the sentries toward the tree line. The rest stripped every food sack, every grain barrel, every bundle of provisions, and vanished before the sentries realized the noise had come from the wrong direction. The entire food supply for 3,000 men disappeared in a single day. Reports of disabled units and vanished supplies reached Brett. I watched from the ridge as his confidence cracked. His horse turned in circles. His voice carried up through the trees, shouting orders that contradicted the ones he had given a minute earlier. A commander confronted with chaos, he cannot see reaches for the only tool he has ever been taught. He ordered the full charge. The order was the lever the plan needed. 3,000 men, already disoriented, already hungry, already afraid, charged into the densest section of Hugo's trap network. More pits, more nets, more spores. The formation dissolved. Officers screamed for order, and the order was already gone. There was a soldier down there I did not see, but I knew about later. His name was Kevin, a poor farmer's third son from a border village in the Arclight territory. He had joined the Knights 3 months earlier because a second son could inherit the land, and a third son could only earn his keep. His mother had given him homemade dried meat and told him she was praying for his success. Kevin dropped his spear somewhere between the second pitfall and the third net. He left his armor in the mud. He walked into the white space between the trees, away from the screaming and the laughter, and he did not look back. Whether he made it home was between him and the road. I did not know his name then. I learned it much later, but I knew, watching from that ridge, that the army below me was made of people. Every one of them had a mother who had packed something and said something and meant it. The traps were not cruel. The doctrine was not cruel, but the men inside the traps were not abstractions, and I would not let myself pretend they were. The time had come. Frost lifted his head from my shoulder. His golden eyes opened fully and looked at me, and in that look was a question I had heard once before. The night 300 soldiers had come, and a cub had become a storm. I nodded. Frost leapt from my shoulder. By the time his paws hit the ground, he was full-sized. He planted all 4 paws on the ridge and roared. The roar was not loud. It was deep. It hit a frequency that traveled through the ground and the trunks and the ribs of every soldier below. The fog rose from the earth as if the land itself were exhaling. Within minutes, there was only white, thick, wet, impenetrable white that swallowed sound and direction, and the difference between forward and back. 3,000 soldiers could no longer see each other. The fog did more than blind them. Sounds moved through it wrong. A growl that came from the left seemed to come from behind. A cry for help started in one place and stopped in another. The soldiers heard footsteps that belonged to no one. They heard breathing that was not theirs. They heard a thin voice calling a name and then silence. And the silence was worse than the voice. Some of them panicked. I could hear it from the ridge, faint and far below. The sound of steel hitting steel. Friendly fire. Men swinging at shapes in the white because the shape might be an enemy, and waiting to find out was worse than swinging. The fog did not create the violence. The fear did. The fog only gave the fear a canvas large enough to work on. I stood on the ridge and spoke. I did not shout. I spoke at the volume I would use across a table, and frost carried my voice through the mist the way water carries a stone to the bottom. The fog amplified it, bent it, delivered it to one specific pair of ears in one specific pit, at the bottom of one specific hole Brett had dug for himself by coming here. Brett heard his brother's voice in the white. I will not say what I said. The words were not a taunt and not a curse. They named the place Brett was standing, the mud and the dark, and the distance between where he was and where he had believed he would be by now. They named it the way you name a thing that has always been true and has only just become visible. That is all I will say about it. Brett broke. The reports I heard later said he dropped to his knees in the mud at the bottom of the pit, and the sound that came out of him was not a word. It was a sound that had been waiting behind his teeth since the day he had given me a rusty sword and kicked my bread across the floor. He gave the order to retreat, and his voice cracked on the second syllable, and the order traveled through what remained of the chain of command the way a last breath travels through a dying man. The army ran. They abandoned weapons, armor, siege gear, dignity, and every story they had told themselves about what this campaign would be. They ran east through the fog, colliding with their own retreating ranks, tripping over traps they had already triggered. By the time frost eased the fog on my signal, the forest was empty of everything except the things they had left behind. 3,000 pairs of footprints, all running the same direction, not a drop of blood. The morning after, Maya and I walked the battlefield. A battlefield with no blood, swords stuck in the mud at odd angles, spears dropped mid-stride, breastplates abandoned in the undergrowth, still shaped like the men who had worn them. 3,000 men had come through this forest, and the forest had swallowed their will without touching their bodies. A dwarf called to me from a cluster of roots near the main trail. He had found a group, over 10 soldiers, huddled at the base of an old oak, their hands raised, their eyes wide. They were begging. Some of them were barely older than me. I told Maya to bring warm food and clean water. She looked at me for a moment, and whatever she saw in my face made her nod without a word. We fed them. We treated the scrapes and sprains they had earned in the chaos. We gave them rations for the walk home and told them they were free to go. No conditions, no oaths, just the road east and the knowledge that they had been treated better by the village they had come to destroy than by the Lord who had sent them. They bowed again. Some of them could not stop bowing. They walked east in a loose group, looking back once, twice, and then they were gone. I watched them go. Some of them would be back. Another army, another order, another march through the same forest. The Lord who held their oaths would not ask them whether they wanted to come. I released them anyway. I would rather fight the same soldiers twice than become my father once. That night, the village held a feast. The bonfire in the square was built from the army's abandoned siege timber. The food was made from the supplies Maya's squad had liberated from the wagons. Hugo's dwarves sat in a circle around a pile of captured swords and took turns mocking the craftsmanship with the enthusiasm of professionals who had found amateurs pretending to be peers. Dull as a butter knife, one of them said, holding up a knight's blade. That is an insult to butter knives, another said, and the circle roared. The rabbit beastmen served dishes made from grain and dried meat the Arclight army would never eat. Children ran between the adults, dodging legs and laughing. Emma and Lily sat beside Frost, who had returned to cub form and was accepting scraps of meat with the dignity of a creature that could level a forest but preferred to be hand-fed. Hugo sat beside me. He filled my mug with ale and said nothing for a long time. Then he told me I was the pride of the village, the pride of every person who lived here. I held the mug and felt something warm behind my ribs that had nothing to do with the ale. I had a family, not the one I had been born into, the one I had built. Liam found me at the edge of the celebration. He was leaning against the fence with his arms folded, looking up at the sky the way he always did when he was thinking about something the rest of us had not caught up to yet. He told me the victory was earned. Then he told me the problem was everything that came after. The capital's power factions would not hear about non-lethal traps and released prisoners. They would hear about a cursed forest and a demon-possessed exile with a sacred beast, and they would decide what that story meant for their own position. The real war, he said, was the one fought in drawing rooms, and it had just started. The capital cut does not belong to me. I was not there, but the pieces came to me later from Liam's network, from merchants, from the retainers who left House Arclight in the weeks that followed, and together they made a picture I could not look away from. Brett returned to the castle, battered and caked in dried mud. The retainers who met him at the gate did not bow. They looked at him the way you look at a thing that has cost more than it was worth. Garrett did not come to the hall. He secluded himself in his chambers and did not speak to anyone, not his son, not his remaining vassals, not the servants who brought meals he did not eat. Brett stood alone in the audience hall. The candles guttered, the banners hung limp. The hall that had once held the ceremony where my father disowned me now held only his eldest son and the silence of a house that had run out of excuses. The story spread the way fire spreads through dry grass. Merchants carried it. Soldiers who had fled carried it faster. By the time it reached the capital, the forest had become a cursed labyrinth, and I had become a demon-possessed exile, commanding a sacred beast that ate knights whole. The populace gave the battle a name before the historians did: the Rout in the Mist. The Arclight family's military prestige was destroyed in a single season of gossip. Allied nobles wrote polite letters of regret and withdrew their support. Trade agreements expired. The rats left the ship with the practiced grace of rats who had been preparing for the swim. The territory was dying. Crops at a fraction of their former yield. Water sources failing the way they had been failing since my father exiled the son whose skill had been holding the land together without anyone noticing. The king's response was swift. A royal envoy arrived at Arclight Castle on a gray morning. He was admitted to the audience hall, where Garrett sat on the high seat for the first time in days. Aged a decade in weeks, his uniform dull and his eyes empty. Brett stood at the back of the hall. He had not changed his clothes. There was still dried mud in his hair from the pit. The envoy did not offer condolences. He unrolled a parchment and read the decree in a voice that carried no pity and no satisfaction, only the flat authority of a crown that had made a decision and was not interested in feedback. House Arclight was reduced from marquise to count. 1/3 of the territory was confiscated and returned to the crown. Garrett was stripped of the position of Knight Commander of the Kingdom, a title that had been in the Arclight line for 2 generations. And the Sacred Beast Village and its surrounding lands were declared a special royal autonomous territory, answerable to the crown alone, independent of any Arclight authority. The envoy rolled the parchment. He bowed once. He left. Garrett did not speak. He sat on the high seat and stared at the far wall as if the wall held an answer he could no longer read. Brett collapsed. His knees hit the stone floor of the audience hall, and the sound echoed through the empty room. And in the silence that followed, a phrase surfaced in his head that he had not thought about in years. 2 words, the exact 2 words he had thrown at his younger brother when they were children, after their father had punished Adrian for something Brett had done, and Brett had stood over him and said it with the casual cruelty of a boy who believed the world would always agree with him. Serves you right, the words would not stop. They echoed the way his knees had echoed on the stone. They bounced off the walls of the hall where his family's history had ended, and they came back to him, and they came back again, and they did not stop. Because the cruelest thing about the truth is that it does not need to be loud. I did not know any of that. I was sitting on the hill above the village. The moons were rising over the eastern valley, the larger one silver and the smaller one copper. and the village behind me was still glowing from the bonfire that had not yet burned down. Maya was walking up the path with 2 mugs of tea. The light from the village hall caught the steam rising from the mugs and turned it gold. She sat beside me and handed me the tea. We did not speak for a while. The forest of despair stood behind the village like a monument to what we had done. Dark and tall and quiet now, its work finished. Somewhere east of those hills, a king's envoy was delivering a decree that would end the family I had been born into. Somewhere east of those hills, my brother was on his knees in an empty hall, hearing his own childhood cruelty played back to him in a voice he could not shut off. I did not know. The news was riding west, carried by merchants and couriers, and the simple gravity of a story too large to stay in one place. I sat on the hill with Maya. The tea was warm. The village was loud. The eastern sky was dark and full of things I could not yet see, moving toward me at the speed of a horse and a rumor. And I did not know to be afraid of them, or grateful for them, or ready for the weight of what they carried. The light from the village hall framed the doorway behind us, warm and steady. The dark ahead stretched to the horizon. I drank the tea and listened to the village celebrate what it had won, and I did not yet know what it had cost the people I used to belong to. The morning after the rout in the mist, the forest did not look like a battlefield. No blood, no bodies, just iron. Swords stuck blade first in the mud, where soldiers had dropped them mid-stride. Shields face down in puddles of dew. Helmets resting upside down in the ferns, like nests that would never hold anything alive. Spears leaning against tree trunks in rows, still trembling faintly when the wind caught their shafts. 3,000 men had passed through this forest in full armor and left everything behind them like a skin they had shed on the way out. Hugo walked ahead of me on the main trap path, his dwarves fanning out behind him with handcarts and rope. They moved through the debris the way farmers move through a field after hail, methodical, unimpressed, already thinking about what came next. Hugo picked up a longsword by the blade, turned it once, and snapped it across his knee the way a man breaks kindling. The steel gave without argument. He tossed both halves into the nearest cart and kept walking. I followed. The men worked in quiet pairs, sorting iron from leather, steel from wood. No one celebrated. No one took trophies. The work had the rhythm of a chore they had done before, even though they had not. Hugo stopped at the center of the second clearing, the one where the pitfall cascade had caught the densest column, and looked at the heap of breastplates and greaves piled against a fallen log. He picked up a helmet, held it at arm's length, and spoke the only direct words I heard from him all morning. Melt every last piece of it. Plows, hoes, nails for the new barn. We have no use for things that were made to hurt people. He set the helmet in the cart and moved on. The dwarves did not pause. They had been waiting for the order before it was given. I stood in that clearing and watched them work and understood something I had not put into words until that moment. My father's house had measured wealth by the number of swords it could put into the field. Hugo measured it by the number of plows he could pull out. The arithmetic was the same. The direction was opposite. Deeper in the forest, Sarah led the women along the secondary paths, pulling up the tear-inducing root clusters and scraping hallucinogenic spores off the bark with flat wooden paddles. She complained the entire time, paraphrased, aimed at no one in particular, that the men had scattered these things across 3 miles of forest and now expected someone else to clean them up before a child wandered in and started seeing colors. The complaint was loud, and the pride underneath it was louder. She had grown those plants herself. She had mixed the compounds, and now she was taking them back because the forest belonged to her people again, not to the traps. By midday, the carts were full. Hugo's forge fires would burn for a week straight, and by the end of it, the swords that had marched against us would be feeding the soil that had defended us. I walked the last path alone, Frost on my shoulder in cub form, his small body warm against my neck. The forest was quiet. The traps had been disarmed. The fog was gone. The only sound was birdsong and the creak of loaded carts rolling back toward the village. I did not feel like a man who had won a war. I felt like a man who had survived a storm and was now looking at the branches it had left on his roof. That night, I climbed the hill above the village and sat in the grass and watched the lights go out one by one in the houses below. Frost curled in my lap. His horn caught the moonlight. I scratched behind his ears and he purred, low and even, and the sound was older than both of us. The village looked the way it always looked from up here. Chimney smoke, lantern glow in the square, the faint shape of the new barn Hugo had framed last month. From this distance, nothing had changed. The war had not reached the rooftops. The war had stayed in the forest where we had put it, and the village had gone back to being a village the way water goes back to being still after you pull your hand out. Footsteps on the hill path. I knew the sound before I turned. Light feet, steady pace, the faint clink of two ceramic mugs bumping together. Maya sat down beside me and held out a mug, chamomile. The steam rose between us in the cold air and vanished. She wrapped both hands around her own mug and looked out at the same view I had been watching. She did not speak for a while. Neither did I. The silence was the kind that does not need to be filled. The kind two people earn after enough nights of not needing to explain what they are looking at. Then she said it, quiet, not looking at me. I was scared for you, not for the village, for you. Her ears pressed flat against her hair, the reflex her people cannot hide. The one that means the words cost her something to say out loud. I did not answer immediately. I let the silence hold the weight of what she had said, and then I told her I was sorry for the worry. I told her I was not alone, that she and the others had made sure of that a long time ago. She turned away. Her ears stayed flat. She mumbled something about how it was not only him she had been worried about, that anyone would worry about the village lord disappearing into a fog, that she had simply been doing her duty as the operations chief. I did not press. The blush across the bridge of her nose said everything the words were trying to take back. We sat. The tea cooled. At some point, her hand drifted close enough to mine on the grass that our knuckles touched, and neither of us moved. Then, footsteps, heavier, faster. The sound of someone who did not want to be climbing a hill at this hour, but had no choice. Liam crested the path with a face I had never seen him wear. Grave, not wry, not amused, not delivering bad news like a weather report the way he usually did. This was something else. He stopped 3 paces from us and bowed, short, formal. He apologized for the interruption. He said there was a report he could not hold until morning. Maya and I looked at each other. We had known it would not last. We had been grateful for the minutes that it did. Liam stood on the hill with the moon behind him and told me what had happened to the family that had thrown me away. He said the battle was already being called the Rout in the Mist across the kingdom. He said the Arclight family's remaining allies had defected. He said the territory's fields, the ones that had been dying since I left, had not recovered. And then he delivered the decree. One sentence, the way Liam always delivered the thing that mattered most. The crown has demoted Arclight from Marquis to Count, confiscated 1/3 of their land, and stripped your father of the Knight Commander rank. He paused. He let the words settle. Then he added, in his own voice, that the Sacred Beast Village and its surrounding lands had been declared a special autonomous region under direct royal oversight. True independence. No noble house above us. No patron to answer to. Maya gasped. A small sound, sharp, pulled in rather than pushed out. Her hand found my wrist. I stood still. I felt nothing. Not triumph, not grief. The family that had measured my worth against a sword and found me lighter than the blade had been weighed by a king and found lighter than their own land. The Knight Commander who had exiled me for a skill he called useless had lost the title he had spent his life earning. The house that had thrown me through the back gate had lost 1/3 of the ground the gate stood on, and I felt nothing. Emptiness. Not the emptiness of loss. The emptiness of a weight lifting after you have carried it so long that you forgot it was there. When it goes, you do not feel light. You feel the shape of the space it used to fill, and the shape is empty. I did not raise my fist. I did not sit down. I did not cry. I stood on the hill and held still and listened to the silence the news had left behind. Liam waited. He was good at waiting. After a moment, he said, paraphrased in the measured way of a man already thinking 3 moves ahead, that there were future measures to plan, that the political landscape had changed, and the village's new status meant new pressures, that the real work would begin tomorrow. He bowed again. He left the hill. Maya sat beside me with both mugs of cold tea forgotten on the grass between us. She did not speak. After a long time, she took my hand once, briefly, and held it. Then she let go and stood. She told me, quietly, that she would give me an hour. She walked down the hill. Her footsteps faded. Frost stayed in my lap, warm and still. I sat on the hill alone. The hour she gave me was the quietest I had known since the day I left House Arclight. I sat in the grass with frost against my knee and looked at the village below, the rooftops, the chimney smoke, the market square where Hugo's feast had been 2 nights ago. And I went back, not forward, not into plans or politics or the new map Liam was already drawing. Back, all the way back. I went back to the ceremony hall, the stone floor, the high windows, the rows of retainers watching a boy whose name they already knew how to forget. I went back to the moment the officiant read my skill aloud, land appraisal, and the room made a sound that was not laughter and not silence, but the space between them where a person's worth gets decided by people who have never looked at him. I went back to the corridor afterward, my father's back, already turned. The cold gaze he gave me over his shoulder, the one that said I had confirmed something he had suspected since I was born. The words he used, the ones about the Arclight blood having no room for what I was. I went back to the gate, Brett standing behind me, the family-crest dagger lifted off my belt and replaced with a short sword, so rusted the crossguard had fused to the hilt. His voice, the word he used, the one that meant I was something that lived off a body it did not belong to. Half my bread kicked across the stone floor, so I would have to bend for it. And I bent, and I picked it up, and I bowed once, the way my mother had taught me when I was very small, and I walked through the back gate. The gate closed. I did not turn around. I remembered all of it, every image, every sound, the cold of the flagstones under my boots, the weight of the rusty sword against my hip, the particular silence of a house that has decided you were never part of it, the way the evening air had smelled of iron and lamp oil, and the faint sweetness of the gardens Martha had planted years before they fired her for being kind to me. And the strangest thing happened on that hill. In the quiet hours after everything my old family had built came apart in a single royal sentence. The pain was gone, not vanished, not buried, not walled off behind something I had built to keep it away from me. Gone the way a bruise is gone. You remember where it was. You can point to the spot, but the tenderness is not there anymore. What remained was closer to nostalgia, the slow ache of a place you no longer live in, a room you walked through once when you were young enough that the ceiling seemed tall, and now you are someone who builds his own ceilings, and the old room is just a room. I looked down at my hip. The rusty sword was still there, the same one. The crossguard still fused, the leather wrap still cracked. I had carried it through every season of this village, through the digging and the building and the harvest, and the first snow, and the refugees, and the merchant and the golem, and the invasion and the fog. I had never traded it for a better one, not because I was sentimental, because the sword was the last thing the old life had given me, and everything I had built since had been built with it still on my hip. They gave me a worn-out blade. I built a kingdom with it still hanging at my side. The thought did not feel triumphant. It felt true, and the trueness of it was enough. The boy who had bent for his own bread in front of a room full of retainers was still inside me somewhere, but he was not afraid anymore. He was just young, and young was a thing I had been, not a thing I still was. I sat with the truth for a while. The moon drifted. The village lights below went dark one by one until only the forge glow from Hugo's workshop remained, a faint orange pulse in the valley like a heartbeat that never slept. Then I heard them, small feet, running. The uneven patter of children who are moving too fast for the hill but have decided the hill does not get a vote. Emma came first, Lily half a step behind. Their dog ears were pressed flat, not embarrassment, not cold, fear. The breathless full-body fear of children who have heard adults talking in voices that mean something has changed and do not yet understand what, but understand enough to know that the person they need might not be where they left him. Emma reached me first and threw her arms around my right leg. Lily caught my left. They held on the way children hold on when they are not hugging you, but anchoring you, making sure you are solid, making sure you are still here, making sure you have not become the kind of person who walks through a gate and does not come back. Emma said something breathless against my knee. It came out in fragments. She had heard the grown-ups talking, and she thought maybe I was leaving, the way the soldiers' families had lost people, and she wanted to make sure I was still here. Lily pressed her face into my other knee and said she had been worried too, her voice muffled and small. I knelt. I gathered them both in, one arm around each. Their small shoulders fit inside the circle of my arms the way the village had fit inside the circle of the valley, as though the space had always been shaped for them and was only waiting for them to arrive. I told them I was not going anywhere, plainly, the way you tell a child a thing they need to hear and mean every syllable of it. Their ears rose, slowly, the fear draining from them the way water drains from cupped hands, not all at once, but steadily and with visible relief. Maya climbed the hill behind them. She scolded them gently, paraphrased, the warm, half-annoyed tone of a woman who had told them to stay in bed and knew before she said it that they would not listen. She stopped at the top of the path and looked at the three of us, the boy who had been exiled and the two children who had chosen him, and something in her expression changed, softened, settled, the way a face settles when it sees a thing it has been hoping for and finds it exactly where it should be. She walked to us. She stood beside me. Frost uncurled from my feet and pressed his small body against my ankle, purring. Maya looked at me, at the twins in my arms, at the village below us, its rooftops catching the first pale light of the new morning, and she said it. "Welcome home, Adrian, to our place." The words landed the way a key lands in a lock it was cut for. I had not known the lock was there until the key found it. The phase one wound, the one that had never been about the exile, never about the title, never about the family that had thrown me away, but always and only about not having a place where someone would say those words and mean them, closed. Warm tears. 2, then 3, then more. They ran down my face, and I did not wipe them. They were not performance. They were not grief. They were the kind of tears that come when a thing you stopped asking for arrives anyway. Carried up a hill by a woman with rabbit ears and 2 mugs of cold tea, and 2 children who were afraid you might disappear. I hugged Emma and Lily tighter. They giggled, confused, delighted, unsure why I was squeezing, but certain that it meant something good. Frost purred louder. Maya smiled. Not a wide smile, the kind that barely moves the mouth but changes the entire face. I did not say anything. I held the twins and I let the tears finish, and I breathed. The eastern sky lightened. Gold crept into the gray. The first birds of the morning began, tentative, then full. The village below us caught the dawn, the way it had caught every dawn since I had built it, quietly, without fanfare, as though it had always been here and always would be. I made a vow, silently, not to Maya, not to the twins, not to Frost, to myself, to protect this happiness, no matter what came next, the politics, the pressures, the new map Liam was already drawing. I would protect what had been built on this hill and in this valley, and in the hearts of the people who had chosen to build it with me. I knew, even as I made it, that no matter what is the kind of promise that gets paid for in currencies you cannot see when you make it. I made it anyway. The 4 of us sat on the hill, me, Maya, Emma, Lily, with Frost between us and the village waking below and the eastern sky wide open with morning. The rusty sword was still on my hip. The chamomile tea was long cold. The twins had fallen asleep against my chest, their small breaths even and trusting. Maya leaned her shoulder against mine. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The line she had given me was the only one the morning needed, and it had already done its work. I watched the dawn and held what I had built and knew, for the first time since I was 16 years old, that I was home.